Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The footprints of Blackwood Trail. The first sign wasn't the figure itself, but the footprints. I, Ranger Elizabeth Beth Walker, had been patrolling Blackwood State Park for 7 years. I knew every trail, every tree, every rock formation. I knew the wildlife, the visitors, the rhythm of the forest. But these footprints, these were something new, something wrong. It was a Tuesday, around 2:47 a.m., during my routine night patrol. The moon was a sliver, hidden behind thick clouds, casting the forest in a deep, impenetrable darkness. My headlamp cut a narrow cone of light through the inky blackness, illuminating the muddy trail ahead. I was on Blackwood Trail, a 5-mile loop popular with hikers during the day, but deserted at this hour. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then I saw them, footprints, large, human-like footprints pressed deep into the mud. But they weren't human. They were too big, for one thing, at least size 15 or 16. And the shape was wrong. The toes were too long, too splayed, the heel too narrow. And there was a strange, almost claw-like impression at the back of each print. I stopped, my heart rate accelerating. I knelt down, examining the footprints closely. The mud was still wet, glistening in the beam of my headlamp. These prints were fresh, made within the last hour, maybe even less. I scanned the surrounding forest, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio on my belt. But the woods remained silent, empty. I took several photos of the footprints with my phone, making sure to capture the size and shape, the unusual details. Then, I continued my patrol, my senses on high alert, my every nerve ending screaming at me to turn back. I finished the loop without further incident, returning to the ranger station, a small log cabin at the edge of the park. I reported the footprints to my supervisor, Ranger Tom Davies, a grizzled veteran with over 30 years of experience. He looked at the photos, his brow furrowed in concern. "Bear?" he suggested, his voice raspy. "No," I said, shaking my head. "The shape is wrong, and the stride, it's too long, too even." Tom sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "Look, Beth, I know you're new to night patrols, but it's probably just some hiker with big feet. Or maybe a prank. Kids messing around." But I knew it wasn't a hiker, and it wasn't a prank. Something about those footprints, about their size, their shape, their unnaturalness, filled me with a deep, unsettling dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was out there, in the darkness of Blackwood Forest. I started researching, delving into the history of the park, searching for any reports of similar footprints, of strange sightings, of unexplained occurrences. I found stories, rumors, whispers of a creature that haunted the woods, a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes and impossibly large feet. The local Native American tribe, the Lenape, had legends about it, calling it the Stalker of the Woods, a being that preyed on lost travelers, on those who strayed from the path. The stories were dismissed as folklore, as campfire tales to scare children, but they resonated with what I had seen, with the footprints I had found. The next night, I went back to Blackwood Trail, determined to find more evidence, to prove to myself and to Tom that I wasn't imagining things. I arrived at the trailhead just before midnight, the moon still hidden behind thick clouds. The forest was silent, expectant, as if holding its breath. I started down the trail, my headlamp cutting through the darkness, my senses on high alert. I walked slowly, deliberately, scanning the ground, searching for any sign of the creature, of its footprints. After about an hour, I found them, more footprints identical to the ones I had seen the previous night. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud, leading off the trail into the dense undergrowth. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't a hiker. This was something else. Something that moved through the forest at night, something that left behind impossible footprints. I hesitated. My rational mind told me to turn back, to report my findings to Tom, to let the authorities handle it. But my curiosity, my sense of duty, my need to know, pushed me forward. I followed the footprints. They led me deep into the woods, away from the marked trail, into a tangle of trees and underbrush. The air grew colder, heavier, with a faint, musky odor that I couldn't place. The footprints continued, unwavering, leading me deeper and deeper into the darkness. Then I saw it, a figure standing in a small clearing ahead. It was tall, impossibly so, at least 8 feet, and silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon, which had finally broken through the clouds. It was facing away from me, its back to me. I couldn't see any details, just a dark, shapeless mass, but I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that it was the creature that had made those footprints. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I reached for my radio, intending to call for backup, but my hand froze. The figure turned. It turned slowly, deliberately, its movements fluid and graceful, yet somehow unnatural. As it turned, the moonlight illuminated its form, revealing details that made my blood run cold. It was humanoid in shape, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, too thin, its torso elongated, its head small and narrow, perched atop a long, sinuous neck. And its face, it had no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, blank expanse of skin, stretched taut over bone. But it could see me. I knew it. I could feel its gaze, its attention, focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It took a step towards me, its feet making no sound on the forest floor. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but I was paralyzed, trapped by a fear so profound it stole my breath, my voice, my will. The figure raised its arm, its hand outstretched, its fingers long and skeletal, tipped with what looked like claws. And then it spoke. Its voice was a whisper, a dry, rustling sound, like wind through dead leaves. But it wasn't coming from the figure's mouth, because it had no mouth. It was coming from everywhere. Elizabeth, my name, spoken by a voice that was both alien and familiar, a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, from the heart of the ancient forest. I stumbled backward, my legs weak and unsteady. I tripped over a root, falling heavily to the ground. The figure continued to approach, its movements slow and deliberate, its faceless gaze fixed on me. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs, my lungs burning. I had to get away, had to escape. I turned and ran, blindly, through the woods, not caring where I was going, just wanting to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. I could hear it behind me, not footsteps, but a soft, rustling sound, like dry leaves skittering across the forest floor. It was following me, pursuing me, relentless in its pursuit. I ran until I could run no more, collapsing against a tree, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. The rustling sound had stopped. The figure was gone, but I knew it was still out there, waiting, watching. I had to get back to the ranger station, had to warn Tom, had to tell someone what I had seen. I stumbled back to the trail, my legs aching, my lungs burning. I followed the familiar path, my headlamp cutting a narrow cone of light through the darkness. I reached the ranger station, my body covered in sweat, my clothes torn and muddy. I burst through the door, startling Tom, who was sitting at his desk, sipping coffee. "Beth!" he exclaimed, jumping to his feet. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. I just stood there, gasping for air, my body trembling. Tom rushed to my side, his expression filled with concern. "Are you all right? Did you see something?" I nodded slowly, my eyes wide with terror. It was out there," I managed to say, my voice hoarse and unsteady. "The creature, the footprints, it It spoke my name. Tom's expression changed from concern to skepticism. "Beth," he said, his voice gentle, "you're exhausted. You've been working too many night shifts. You need some rest." "No," I said, shaking my head frantically. "You don't understand. It's real. It's out there. And it's hunting." Tom sighed, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Come on, Beth," he said. "Let's get you cleaned up. You can tell me all about it in the morning." He led me to the small bathroom, helped me wash the mud from my face and hands, gave me a clean shirt to change into. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. He thought I was hallucinating, imagining things, cracking under the pressure. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. And I knew that the creature was still out there, in the darkness of Blackwood Forest, waiting for me. I spent the rest of the night in the ranger station, trying to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, its faceless gaze, its outstretched hand. I heard its whisper, my name, echoing in my mind. At dawn, I left the station, determined to find proof, to gather evidence that would convince Tom and anyone else that I wasn't crazy. I went back to the clearing where I had encountered the figure, armed with my camera, a measuring tape, and a plaster casting kit. The clearing was empty. No sign of the figure, no sign of a struggle, but the footprints were still there. Fainter now, the mud drying in the morning sun, but still visible. I photographed them, meticulously documenting their size, their shape, their unusual details. I measured the stride length, the distance between the prints, the depth of the impressions. Then, I made plaster casts of several of the best preserved prints, carefully mixing the plaster, pouring it into the impressions, and waiting for it to harden. The casts, when they were dry, were perfect replicas of the footprints, capturing every detail, every nuance. They were undeniable proof that something unnatural had walked through these woods. I took the casts, the photos, and my story back to Tom. He listened patiently, his expression skeptical at first, then slowly changing to concern. He examined the casts, turning them over in his hands, his eyes studying the strange shape, the elongated toes, the claw-like heel. He looked at the photos, comparing them to the casts, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he spoke. "Okay, Beth," he said, his voice serious. "I don't know what this is, but it's something we need to investigate." He called the state police requesting assistance. He showed them the casts, the photos, my report. They were skeptical at first, dismissing it as a hoax, a prank, a case of misidentification. But the casts couldn't be denied. They were too detailed, too precise, too unnatural. The police launched an investigation, bringing in wildlife experts, forensic specialists, and even a few unconventional consultants. They searched the forest using dogs, drones, and infrared cameras. They found more footprints, similar to the ones I had discovered, leading deeper and deeper into the woods. But they never found the creature. The investigation eventually stalled, the evidence inconclusive, the mystery unsolved. The official report classified the incident as unexplained, attributing the footprints to an unknown animal, possibly a deformed bear or a large, unknown primate. But I knew the truth, and so did Tom. We continued to patrol Blackwood Forest, our senses always on high alert, our eyes always searching the darkness. We never saw the figure again, but we knew it was still out there, waiting, watching, and sometimes late at night, when the wind was still and the moon was hidden behind the clouds, I would hear it. A faint, rustling sound, like dry leaves skittering across the forest floor, and a whisper, carried on the wind, calling my name. Elizabeth. I knew it would never truly leave. It was a part of the forest now, a part of the darkness, a part of me. The footprints were proof of something beyond normal, and it was still out there. The official investigation might have been closed, but Tom and I continued our own unofficial inquiry. We delved deeper into the local legends, the Native American folklore, the history of disappearances in Blackwood Forest. We discovered a pattern. the sightings of the figure, the unexplained disappearances, they all seemed to cluster around the time of the new moon, when the darkness was at its deepest. And they all occurred near Blackwood Trail, or on paths leading off from it. We also found a recurring symbol, a strange, angular glyph that appeared in several of the old newspaper articles about the disappearances, carved into trees near where the footprints were found, and even etched onto a rock near the ranger station. It was the same symbol I had seen on the muddy footprints, on the office door at Morgan's Ridge, and now it was here in Blackwood Forest. We researched the symbol, consulting with experts in cryptography, linguistics, and ancient cultures. We learned that it was a very old symbol, predating the arrival of European settlers in the area. It was associated with protection, with warding off evil spirits, with containment. But the symbol was always found outside the areas where the disappearances occurred, as if it were marking a boundary, a perimeter, a line that should not be crossed. We realized, with a growing sense of dread, that Blackwood Trail, the popular hiking trail that ran through the heart of the forest, was inside that boundary. We were letting people walk right into the creature's hunting ground. We decided to take action. We couldn't close the trail officially, not without proof, not without causing a panic. But we could discourage people from using it. We started posting warning signs, citing increased bear activity and unstable trail conditions. We moved the trail markers, subtly altering the route, leading hikers away from the areas where the footprints had been found. We even spread rumors among the local community about the trail being haunted, about strange noises and unsettling sightings. It worked. Traffic on Blackwood Trail dwindled. People started choosing other routes, other trails. But we knew it wasn't enough. The creature was still out there. And as long as the trail existed, as long as people ventured into the darkness, it would continue to hunt. We needed a more permanent solution. We needed to find a way to contain it, to banish it, to end its reign of terror. We returned to the Native American legends, to the stories of the Wampanoag tribe searching for clues. We found references to a ritual, a ceremony performed by the tribe's shamans, to appease the spirit that dwelled in the woods, to keep it contained within its designated territory. The ritual involved fire, light, and a specific incantation, chanted under the new moon, at the heart of the creature's domain. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance we had. We gathered the necessary materials, the herbs, the candles, the silver knife, as described in the fragmented accounts of the ritual. We studied the incantation, painstakingly translating the ancient words, practicing the pronunciation, the rhythm, the cadence. We waited for the next new moon, and then we went back into the darkness. The night of the new moon was cold and clear. The forest was silent, expectant, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. We followed the trail of footprints, deeper into the woods than I had ever gone before, to a small, hidden clearing, where the creature had first revealed itself to me. This was the heart of its domain. I could feel it. The air was heavy, charged with a strange, almost electric energy. The trees seemed to lean inwards, their branches twisted and gnarled, as if recoiling from some unseen presence. We set up the ritual, carefully arranging the candles, the herbs, the silver knife. We lit the candles, their flames flickering in the darkness, casting long, dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. Tom stood beside me, his face grim, his hand resting on the hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't believe in the ritual, not really, but he trusted me, and he was prepared to defend us if necessary. I began to chant, my voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as I repeated the ancient words, the unfamiliar syllables flowing from my lips, resonating with the power of generations past. The air grew colder. The metallic scent, now familiar and deeply unsettling, intensified. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, echoing through the forest. The creature was coming. We continued chanting, our voices rising above the growl, the words of the incantation pouring from our lips, a desperate plea to the ancient spirits, to the forces of nature, to anything that could hear us. The ground began to tremble. The trees shook. The candles flickered violently, threatening to extinguish. And then it appeared, the figure, emerging from the darkness, its form shifting, wavering, its faceless gaze fixed on us. It was taller now, larger, more powerful. Its limbs were elongated, distorted, its movements fluid and terrifying. It approached us slowly, deliberately, its presence radiating a cold, suffocating dread. But this time, something was different. Standing beside the figure, shrouded in shadow, was another presence. Tall, thin, with an outstretched arm. The herder. I realized, with a chilling certainty, that we had been wrong. The herder wasn't guiding the creature. It wasn't protecting it. It was warning it. It was trying to stop it. The herder raised its arm, pointing, not at us, but at the creature. And then it spoke. Its voice was a whisper, a dry, rustling sound, like wind through dead leaves. But this time the words were clear, distinct, understandable.
No.
The creature hesitated, its form flickering, its movements faltering. It turned its faceless gaze towards the herder, a silent question in its absence. Then, with a sudden, convulsive movement, the herder merged with the creature. The two figures became one, a swirling vortex of darkness and shadow, a terrifying amalgamation of two distinct entities. And then it charged. The combined entity rushed towards us, a terrifying blur of darkness and shadow, its speed and power amplified by the fusion. Tom raised his rifle, firing shot after shot, but the bullets seemed to pass right through the creature, having no effect. I continued chanting, my voice rising to a scream, the words of the incantation pouring from my lips, a desperate, final plea. The creature was almost upon us, its gaping maw opening, revealing rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth. Its elongated limbs reached out, grasping, tearing. Then Sarah's voice, clear and strong, joined mine. Enough! I hadn't seen her arrive, hadn't heard her approach. But there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing, holding the frequency disruptor from the Route 60 incident, its blue light pulsing intensely. She aimed the device at the creature, and a wave of energy, visible as a shimmering distortion in the air, washed over it. The creature shrieked, a sound of pure agony, a chorus of screams tearing through the night. Its form flickered, wavered, then exploded, not in a shower of gore or debris, but in a burst of light and shadow, a silent implosion that left behind only emptiness. The silence returned, sudden and absolute. The candles had gone out. The only light came from the moon, now peeking through the clouds, and the faint, fading glow of Sarah's device. We stood there, the three of us, breathing heavily, our bodies trembling, our minds reeling. It was over. The creature was gone. The herder was gone, her hand shaking. It's over, she said, her voice hoarse. For now, I said, my voice barely a whisper. We knew the darkness could return. It always did, in different forms, in different places, under different names. But we also knew that we could fight it, that we could stand against it, that we could protect others from the things that lurked in the shadows. We were changed. The darkness left its mark, but we had also discovered strength. We had learned to hear the whispers, and now to silence them. We left the clearing, leaving the forest to its silence, to its secrets. We walked back to the ranger station, our steps lighter now, the weight of fear lifted from our shoulders. The first hints of dawn were just beginning to appear. The world felt different. The darkness still existed, but we carried a light, a hope for humanity, a hard-won understanding. And we would be ready. The leasing agent's omission. Evelyn had always been practical, a trait honed by years of working as a diagnostic technician at Johns Hopkins. So, when her marriage dissolved and she found herself adrift in the Baltimore real estate market, practicality dictated her choices. The row house at 42A Sycamore Street wasn't perfect, far from it. The radiators hissed and clanked like disgruntled spirits. The floorboards groaned underfoot with every step, and the shared wall with 42B seemed to amplify every whisper and creak. But at $200 a month, a price unheard of in that part of Baltimore, for a restored Victorian dating back to the 1890s, it was a lifeline. The realtor, a brisk woman named Ms. Albright, had been conspicuously silent about the house's previous tenant. It was only when Evelyn was wresting a particularly cumbersome box from the moving truck that Mrs. Nguyen, a woman of indeterminate age from next door, introduced the specter of David Foster. Mrs. Nguyen watched with an unsettlingly knowing look, her eyes narrowed against the weak sunlight. "You do know what happened to the last person who lived here, yes?" she asked, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. Evelyn shook her head, bracing herself for another unwieldy box. Mrs. Nguyen, seemingly undeterred by Evelyn's lack of interest, launched into the tale. 6 months prior, Foster had reportedly fled the house in the dead of night, clad only in his underwear, screaming about curses and unseen footsteps. He ended up in the psychiatric ward of Spring Grove Hospital, a gibbering mess of paranoia and fractured sentences. Evelyn, a woman of science, dismissed it as local folklore. The house had its quirks, certainly. Besides the plumbing's complaints and the chatty walls, there was a faint, persistent scent of old wood and something vaguely floral, like dried potpourri that had lost its potency decades ago. But these were the charms of an old house, she reasoned, not evidence of anything supernatural. The first week passed without incident. Evelyn established a rhythm. Up at 6 a.m., a precise ritual of shower, coffee, and the commute downtown to the hospital. Evenings were quiet, a microwave dinner, an episode or two of a streaming show, and then sleep. The neighboring unit, 42B, remained stubbornly empty, amplifying the silence. Then the footsteps began. It was a Tuesday night in early October, around 2 a.m., when the sound ripped Evelyn from sleep. They were heavy, deliberate thuds, like someone wearing heavy work boots walking across the second floor, hallway directly above her bedroom. Thud, pause, thud, pause. The ancient floorboards groaned under the weight of each impact. Her first thought, a logical one, was burglars, heart hammering against her ribs. Evelyn grabbed her phone and a Louisville Slugger she'd stashed under her bed, a relic from a college softball career she hadn't thought about in years. She crept up the stairs, the wood cold under her bare feet. The second floor was a canvas of deep shadows, only dimly illuminated by the streetlights filtering through the sheer curtains. She checked every room, the spare bedroom, empty and unused, the bathroom, with its chipped porcelain sink, the small office she'd tentatively set up, hoping to inspire some freelance work. Nothing. No sign of forced entry. No windows ajar. The footsteps had ceased. Evelyn tried to rationalize it. Old houses settled, made strange noises. Everyone knew that. But a seed of unease had been planted. The following night, the footsteps returned at the same precise hour. This time, they paced back and forth, a relentless, measured rhythm that went on for nearly an hour. Evelyn lay rigid in bed, the baseball bat clutched in a white-knuckled grip, listening to the slow, methodical thuds traverse the hallway above her. Her carefully constructed wall of logic began to show its first cracks. The third night was the worst. The footsteps, now a nightly occurrence, were accompanied by a new sound. A dragging, scraping noise, like furniture being moved across the hardwood floor above. Evelyn called her landlord, a man named Mr. Abernathy, whose voice always held a weary, slightly exasperated tone. "Mr. Abernathy, I'm telling you, there's someone walking around upstairs at night," Evelyn insisted, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and frustration. "Ms. Reynolds, that house is over 100 years old." Abernathy sighed, his words crackling through the phone's speaker. "Pipes expand and contract. Wood shifts. Old buildings settle. It's perfectly normal." "This isn't settling," Evelyn countered, her grip tightening on the phone. "These are heavy footsteps, and there's a dragging sound, like someone's moving furniture." Abernathy sighed again, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of countless tenant complaints. Ms. Reynolds, I assure you, the second floor is structurally sound. We had it thoroughly inspected before you moved in. If you're truly concerned, I can send a contractor out. Next week, perhaps. Next week? Evelyn felt a surge of anger. I'm hearing this every night. I can't sleep. I can't. But Abernathy had already tuned her out, offering platitudes about old houses and their charms. Evelyn hung up, feeling more alone than ever. She couldn't wait a week. The lack of sleep was starting to affect her work. She found herself dozing off during scans, misreading charts. Her supervisor, Dr. Ramirez, a woman known for her sharp eyes and even sharper tongue, had noticed. Evelyn, Dr. Ramirez had said, her voice low and concerned, you seem off. Perhaps you should consider taking some personal time. Instead of taking time off, Evelyn became obsessed. She spent her lunch breaks at the Baltimore County Records office, poring over dusty documents dating back to the house's construction in 1891. She found nothing remarkable, just a succession of owners and tenants, a mundane chronicle of ordinary lives. No deaths were recorded at the address, no violent crimes. The most recent entry was David Foster's rental agreement, neatly filed and ending abruptly in April of the previous year. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Evelyn decided to track down Foster. Finding him wasn't easy. She had to navigate the labyrinthine bureaucracy of Spring Grove Hospital, feigning a familial connection to gain access. When they finally brought him to the visiting room, Evelyn barely recognized him from the blurry driver's license photo attached to his rental application. His hair had gone completely white. His face was etched with deep lines, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. The footsteps, Foster said, his voice a hoarse whisper, the moment Evelyn sat down. He didn't ask if she was hearing them. He knew. You're hearing them too, aren't you? Always around 2:00 a.m. Evelyn leaned forward, her own anxieties momentarily forgotten in the face of Foster's raw terror. What are they? What's causing them? Foster's eyes darted around the room, as if expecting to see someone or something lurking in the corners. It's not what, he whispered, his voice dropping even lower. It's who? The original owner, Harrison Blake. He built both houses, lived in 42A, died there too. In 1916, fell down the stairs, broke his neck. Evelyn frowned. But there's no record of anyone dying in the house. Because they covered it up. Foster's voice rose, attracting the attention of a nearby nurse. His family, they didn't want the scandal. But I found letters, old newspapers. Blake was obsessed with the occult, conducted rituals in the basement, tried to contact the dead. His voice trailed off, becoming almost inaudible. He succeeded too well. Opened a door he couldn't close. That's why the footsteps, they never stop. That's why they get louder, closer. A nurse approached, her expression firm. Time's up, Mr. Foster. As they led him away, Foster twisted in his chair, shouting back at Evelyn, check the basement, behind the coal chute. The truth, it's there. Evelyn spent that afternoon, fueled by adrenaline and a growing sense of dread, in the basement of 42A Sycamore Street. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight and a crowbar she'd borrowed from Mrs. Nguyen, who had offered it with a disturbingly knowing nod, she explored the damp, dimly lit space. The old coal chute, a relic from a bygone era, was still there, sealed shut with bricks and mortar decades ago when the house had been converted to gas heating. The air was thick with the smell of dust and damp earth. Evelyn, her practical mind warring with the growing unease Foster's words had instilled, began to pry at the bricks behind the chute. They were loose, crumbling easily under the pressure of the crowbar. Within minutes, she'd created a small opening, revealing a dark cavity behind the brickwork. Inside, nestled amongst the dust and debris, was a metal box, badly rusted and corroded. Evelyn pulled it out, her hands trembling slightly. The box was heavy, its hinges stiff with age. With some effort, she managed to force it open. The contents were simple. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but legible. The handwriting was cramped and spidery, but Evelyn recognized it from the documents she'd seen at the records office. Harrison Blake's personal diary. Most of the entries were mundane, detailing the day-to-day concerns of a late 19th century businessman. Records of transactions, appointments, social engagements. But as Evelyn flipped through the pages, the tone of the entries began to shift. In the months leading up to October 1916, Blake's writing became increasingly erratic, filled with references to seances, spirit boards, and increasingly disturbing experiments. He wrote of voices whispering from the walls, of shadows that moved independently of any light source, of footsteps that followed him through the house, even when he was alone. He described attempts to communicate with the other side, driven by a morbid curiosity and a growing obsession with the occult. The final entry was dated October 31st, 1916. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she read the words, scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible hand. "It's here. God help me, it's here. I can hear it coming up the stairs. The ritual, it worked, but I was wrong. So terribly wrong. It's not a door to the other side. It's a door to something else. Something that was never meant to." The entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if Blake had been interrupted in the act of writing. Evelyn closed the journal, her hands shaking. The rational part of her brain screamed that it was all coincidence, folklore, the ramblings of a disturbed mind. But the chilling precision of Foster's description, the heavy thuds she heard every night, the unsettling feeling of being watched, it all coalesced into a terrifying certainty. That night, the footsteps started earlier, around 1 a.m., and they were different, faster, more purposeful. They moved from the hallway into the spare bedroom directly above Evelyn's, a room she deliberately left empty, as if subconsciously avoiding a confrontation. There was a new sound, too, a sharp, scratching noise, like nails dragging across the hardwood floor. Then, silence, a heavy, pregnant silence that pressed down on Evelyn like a physical weight. She lay in bed, every muscle tense, listening. The digital clock on her nightstand clicked over to 1:59 a.m. A single floorboard creaked at the top of the stairs. Another halfway down. Another 3 steps from the bottom. Evelyn couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath, visible now as white clouds in the frigid air, caught in her throat. The final step groaned under a heavy, unseen weight. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossed her bedroom floor. The mattress compressed slightly on one side, as if someone or something had sat down beside her. Evelyn felt a hot, fetid breath on her face. She ran. Evelyn didn't stop to grab anything. Not her phone, not her wallet, not even shoes. She bolted out the front door, clad only in her thin pajamas and socks, her bare feet slapping against the cold pavement as she sprinted through the deserted, pre-dawn streets of Baltimore. Behind her, echoing from the open doorway of 42A Sycamore Street, she heard a sound that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. A deep, guttural laugh, devoid of any human warmth. They found her 3 blocks away, huddled in the doorway of a 24-hour convenience store, shivering uncontrollably and babbling incoherently. The police report, which Evelyn later obtained, noted signs of extreme psychological distress, but no evidence of an intruder or break-in at her address. The officers, their faces a mixture of pity and suspicion, took her to the nearest hospital. The diagnosis was swift: acute stress reaction, possible psychotic break. They offered medication, therapy, a temporary stay in the psychiatric ward. Evelyn refused it all. She checked herself out after 2 days, against medical advice, her mind a whirlwind of terror and denial. She never returned to 42A Sycamore Street. She left everything behind: her furniture, her clothes, her carefully curated collection of medical textbooks, even the framed photo of her parents that sat on her nightstand. The landlord, Mr. Abernathy, kept her security deposit and the first month's rent. a consequence Evelyn accepted with numb indifference. She fled to her sister, Clara, in Philadelphia, seeking refuge in the familiar comfort of family. She started looking for a new job, a new apartment, a new life, anything to distance herself from the horror she'd experienced. She chose a modern high-rise apartment building, all concrete and steel, with no creaking floorboards, no shadowy basements, no history. But sometimes, late at night, when the city outside fell silent, Evelyn would still hear them. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving slowly across a distant floor. And she would wonder about 42A Sycamore Street, about what Harrison Blake had truly unleashed with his ill-fated rituals, about the door he had opened that could never be closed. She saw the advertisement online a few weeks later. Charming Victorian row house, $200 a month, unbeatable Baltimore location. A steal, the ad proclaimed. Evelyn knew the footsteps were waiting, patiently, for the next unsuspecting tenant. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the cycle would continue. She just hoped, with a desperate, fragile hope, that whoever moved in next would be quicker to flee than she had been. She should have. She really, really should have. Evelyn tried to warn others in her own way. She started monitoring online rental listings, obsessively checking for any mention of 42A Sycamore Street. When it inevitably reappeared, she'd post anonymous comments on the listing, vague warnings about structural issues and unexplained noises. She knew it wouldn't be enough, that most people would dismiss her comments as the ramblings of a disgruntled former tenant, but she had to try. She even considered contacting the local newspaper, but the words always failed her. How could she explain the unexplainable? How could she convey the sheer, bone-chilling terror of those unseen footsteps, that guttural laugh, the feeling of cold, fetid breath on her face? They'd think she was crazy, just like the police, just like the doctors.
The nightmares persisted.
She'd wake up in a cold sweat, her heart hammering, the sound of those heavy footsteps echoing in her ears. She'd see Harrison Blake's frantic handwriting in her mind's eye, that final, unfinished sentence. It's not a door to the other side. It's a door to something else. Clara, her sister, tried to help. She suggested therapy, meditation, even a weekend getaway to the beach. But Evelyn knew that no amount of sunshine or soothing ocean waves could erase what she'd experienced. The darkness of 42A Sycamore Street had seeped into her bones. One night, months after her escape, Evelyn found herself driving past her old neighborhood in Baltimore. She hadn't planned it. She'd simply taken a wrong turn, she told herself. But as she approached Sycamore Street, her hands tightened on the steering wheel, her pulse quickening. She slowed the car, her eyes drawn to the familiar row of Victorian houses. 42A looked ordinary. The windows were dark, but a faint light glowed from the unit next door, 42B. A new tenant, perhaps? Evelyn parked across the street, her gaze fixed on the empty front porch of 42A. She sat there for a long time, the engine idling, her mind replaying the events of those terrifying nights. She almost convinced herself it had all been a hallucination, a product of stress and sleep deprivation. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement in the second-floor window, the spare bedroom where the footsteps had always been the loudest. A shadow, tall and thin, passed briefly across the sheer curtains. It was too quick to be certain, but Evelyn knew. She knew. She put the car in gear and drove away, her hands shaking, her heart a trapped bird in her chest. She didn't look back. She never would. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that the footsteps would continue, waiting patiently in the darkness of 42A Sycamore Street, for the next unsuspecting soul to unlock the door. And she knew, with a sickening dread, that the cycle of terror would begin anew. The realtor's silence had condemned another, the cigarette smoker on the 20th story. The first clue wasn't the footsteps themselves, but the residue they left behind, 3 cigarette butts, Marlboro Reds, neatly arranged beside the air conditioning unit on the roof of the Riverside office building. Joseph Joe Miller, had been the janitor there for nearly a decade, and I knew every inch of that building, Every stain on the carpet, every flickering fluorescent light, every unauthorized cigarette but discarded on my watch. It was a Wednesday, around 9:47 p.m. I was making my rounds, the usual monotonous routine of emptying trash cans, vacuuming carpets, and cleaning bathrooms. The building was mostly empty by this hour, just a few stragglers working late in their cubicles. The roof access door was on the 20th floor, the top floor of the building. It was always locked. I had the only key, a heavy, brass key that hung on my belt loop alongside a dozen others, each meticulously labeled. I checked that door 3 times every night, a habit born of years of dealing with teenagers trying to sneak up for a smoke and a view. I unlocked the door, stepped out onto the roof, and immediately smelled it, the sharp, acrid scent of cigarette smoke. I scanned the roof, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air conditioning units hummed quietly, their metal casings gleaming in the moonlight. The city lights spread out below, a vast, glittering panorama. And there, beside the largest AC unit, were the cigarette butts. 3 of them, Marlboro Reds, still warm. I frowned, my hand instinctively going to my pocket. I didn't smoke, and the building had a strict no-smoking policy, enforced with an almost religious zeal by the management. I picked up the butts. The neatness of the arrangement, the fact that they were still warm, the wrongness of it all. I checked the roof access door again. Locked, secure. No signs of forced entry. I completed my rounds, my mind racing, trying to come up with a rational explanation. But the image of those 3 cigarette butts, glowing faintly in the darkness, stuck with me. The next night, the same thing. I reached the 20th floor, unlocked the roof access door, and stepped out into the night air. The smell of cigarette smoke hit me immediately, and there they were, 3 more cigarette butts, Marlboro Reds, in the exact same spot. This time, I also found footprints, faint but distinct in the thin layer of dust and gravel that covered the roof. They were large, size 11 or 12, I estimated, and they led from the AC unit to the edge of the roof, then back again. I took photos with my phone, documenting everything. I sent the photos to my supervisor, Mr. Henderson, a stern, humorless man who took building regulations very seriously. His response was predictable. "Miller, are you sure you're locking the door properly? Check it again. And make sure those smokers aren't getting past you." I knew I was locking the door. I always locked the door, but I checked it again anyway, 3 times. The following nights were a repeat of the same unsettling pattern. Every evening, I'd find 3 fresh cigarette butts, Marlboro Reds, beside the AC unit. Sometimes I'd find footprints. Sometimes I'd find nothing but the lingering scent of smoke. I started varying my routine, changing the times of my rounds, doubling back unexpectedly, hoping to catch the smoker in the act. But I never saw anyone. The roof was always empty, except for the evidence they left behind. I started feeling watched, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I'd find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the shadows, listening for any sound out of place. I installed a small, battery-powered motion sensor near the AC unit, hoping to trigger an alarm if anyone approached. The sensor was useless. It never went off, even though the cigarette butts continued to appear. I started researching the building's history, digging through old records, newspaper archives, searching for any clue, any explanation for what was happening. I found nothing. The Riverside office building was relatively new, built in the 1980s on the site of an old parking lot. No reports of strange occurrences, no unexplained deaths, no hauntings. Then one night, I heard it. Footsteps. I was cleaning the 19th floor restrooms around 10:15 p.m. when I heard a distinct thudding sound coming from above. It was slow, deliberate, rhythmic. Thud, thud, thud. Someone was walking on the roof. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried out of the restroom, heading for the service elevator. I had to catch them, had to find out who was getting onto the roof and how. I reached the 20th floor, my hand hovering over the roof access. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping out onto the roof. The air was cold, crisp, carrying the faint scent of cigarette smoke. But the roof was empty. I scanned the area, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. No one. Then I saw it. A scuff mark on the concrete ledge near the north edge of the roof. Like someone had been sitting there, dangling their legs over the side, 20 stories above the street. My stomach churned. I backed away from the ledge, my heart hammering against my ribs. I checked the door again. Locked. Secure. I didn't understand. How were they getting up here? And why? I went back inside, my mind racing. The scuff mark on the ledge, it suggested something more than just a casual smoker sneaking a cigarette. It suggested someone reckless, or desperate, or something else entirely. I decided to review the security camera footage. I knew the cameras didn't cover the roof itself, but they did monitor the hallways leading to the roof access door. Maybe, just maybe, I could catch a glimpse of whoever was getting up there. I spent the next hour in the security office, reviewing hours of footage. I watched myself going about my rounds, unlocking and locking the door, checking the hallways. I saw cleaning staff, late-night office workers, and the occasional delivery person. But I saw no one, absolutely no one, approaching the roof access door other than myself. It was as if the smoker was materializing on the roof, leaving their evidence, and then vanishing into thin air. I was starting to doubt my own sanity. Was I imagining things? Was the stress of the job, the long hours, the constant solitude, finally getting to me? Then, I saw something on the footage that made my blood run cold. It was from earlier that evening, around 9:50 p.m., just a few minutes before I had heard the footsteps. The camera showed the 20th floor hallway, empty except for me, mopping the floor near the restrooms. And then the roof access door opened. Slowly, silently, it swung inward, revealing nothing, just darkness. I watched, mesmerized, as the door remained open for several seconds, then slowly closed again, clicking shut. I hadn't opened that door. I hadn't heard it open, and there was no one there, but the camera footage didn't lie. The door had opened on its own. I rewound the footage, playing it again and again, zooming in, enhancing the image, searching for any explanation. There was none. The door simply opened and then closed. I felt a surge of panic, a cold, suffocating dread that gripped me in its icy embrace. This wasn't just a smoker. This wasn't just a prank. This was something else. Something that defied logic, that defied explanation. Something that could open locked doors, leave footprints and cigarette butts, and vanish without a trace. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just ignore it, couldn't just pretend it wasn't happening. I decided to set a trap, a different kind of trap. My plan was simple, perhaps even foolishly so, but I was desperate. I couldn't rely on motion sensors or security cameras. I needed something more direct. I went to the basement storage room and found what I was looking for. A roll of thin, almost invisible fishing line. I also grabbed a small, empty metal can. Back on the 20th floor, I carefully strung the fishing line across the hallway, just in front of the roof access door, about 6 inches off the ground. I tied one end of the line to the door handle and the other end to the metal can, placing the can on a small shelf near the wall. The idea was that if anyone or anything opened the door, it would pull the fishing line, knocking the can off the shelf and creating a noise, alerting me. It was a crude system, but it was the best I could come up with. I spent the rest of my shift on the 20th floor, staying close to the hallway, listening, watching, waiting. The building was silent. The only sound, the faint hum of the ventilation system and the occasional creak of the building settling. Hours passed. Nothing. I started to doubt my plan, to doubt my sanity. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe there was a perfectly rational explanation for all of this. Then, at precisely 2:17 a.m., I heard it. A faint, metallic clatter. The can. My heart leaped into my throat. I grabbed my flashlight and ran towards the hallway. The roof access door was closed. The fishing line was still intact, stretched taut across the hallway. But the can was on the floor, lying on its side, a few feet away from the shelf. Something had moved it. Something had triggered the trap. But how? I cautiously approached the door, my flashlight beam sweeping across the hallway. Nothing. No one. I pressed my ear against the door, listening. Silence. Then, a faint scraping sound coming from the other side of the door, like fingernails dragging across metal. I recoiled, my blood running cold. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that whatever was on the other side of that door was not human. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest, my flashlight beam shaking in my hand. I reached for my radio, intending to call for help, but I knew it was useless. No one would believe me. They'd think I was crazy. The scraping sound continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, a voice that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was mocking, taunting. Then the door handle began to turn. Slowly, deliberately, it rotated, clicking softly as the latch disengaged. I knew I should run, should get out of there, should escape while I still could. But I was frozen, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and curiosity. I had to see. I had to know what was on the other side of that door. The door creaked open, revealing darkness, not just the absence of light, but a deeper, more profound darkness, a void that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight, to swallow it whole. And then, something moved within the darkness, a shape, tall, thin, indistinct. It stepped out of the doorway into the hallway, and I saw its face, or rather, I saw where its face should have been. There was nothing there, just a blank, featureless void, a smooth expanse of nothingness. It was the same figure I had seen in my nightmares, the same figure that had haunted my thoughts, my dreams, my waking hours. The figure raised its arm, and I saw that it was holding something, a cigarette, a Marlboro Red. It brought the cigarette to its non-face, to the spot where a mouth should have been, and then it inhaled. I saw a faint, orange glow emanating from within the void, as if the cigarette were burning inside the creature's head. Then it exhaled. A plume of smoke, thick and acrid, drifted out of the void, filling the hallway with the familiar, yet terrifying scent of Marlboro Reds. The figure took a step closer, its movements fluid and graceful, yet somehow wrong, unnatural. It spoke. Its voice was a whisper, a dry, rustling sound, like wind through dead leaves. But it wasn't coming from its non-face. It was coming from everywhere. Joe, my name, spoken by a voice that was both alien and familiar, a voice that seemed to come from the depths of my own soul. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but I was paralyzed, trapped by a fear so profound it stole my breath, my voice, my will. The figure continued, its voice echoing. "We know you've been looking for answers, Joe." Another step, the smoke curling from where a mouth should be, the scent now overpowering, mixing with something older, colder. "We can give them to you." It gestured with the hand holding the cigarette, not towards the roof access door, but down the hall, towards the service elevators. "Come with us, Joe. See what's beyond the walls." My mind was a whirlwind. Beyond the walls? What did that even mean? Was this the same entity from the shifting elevator? The apartment building? Were they all connected? The figure took another step. I could feel a pressure now, not physical, but mental. A subtle urging, a pulling sensation, drawing me towards it, towards the elevators. My training, my years of mundane routine, screamed at me to run, to call for backup, even if they wouldn't believe me, to do anything but follow this thing. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger since that first night on the roof, needed to know, needed to understand. The figure, still holding the faintly glowing cigarette, turned and began to walk towards the service elevators. It didn't look back. It didn't need to. It knew I would follow. My feet, seemingly of their own accord, began to move. One step, then another. I followed the faceless smoker down the hallway, towards the elevators, towards the unknown, towards answers or oblivion. I didn't know, but I had to find out. The hallway seemed to stretch, to elongate, the fluorescent lights flickering erratically. The air grew colder, carrying that now familiar metallic tang, mixed with the ever-present scent of Marlboro Reds. We reached the service elevators. The figure pressed the call button and I waited with it. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, its doors sliding open to reveal not the usual steel box, but a swirling vortex of darkness, identical to the one I had seen in the doorway to the roof. The figure stepped inside, without hesitation, without looking back. I paused, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to run, to escape. But it was too late. I had come too far. I had to know. I took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. The doors closed behind me, and the elevator began to move. Not up, not down, sideways. The familiar, stomach-churning sensation of impossible movement returned. The air grew thick, heavy, with the scent of cigarette smoke and something else. Something ancient, something unearthly. I could hear whispers now, all around me, murmuring, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from the very walls of the elevator. The floor indicator, which had been normal just moments before, began to flicker, displaying a chaotic jumble of numbers, symbols, and glyphs, a meaningless cascade of light and static. Then it stopped, on a single symbol. Oh, the same symbol I had seen in the shifting elevator weeks ago. The doors opened, and I stepped out into nothingness, a vast, empty void, stretching as far as the eye could see. No walls, no floor, no ceiling, just nothing. The figure was there, standing a few feet away, still holding the cigarette, its faint orange glow the only source of light in the infinite darkness. Where are we? I asked, my voice trembling. The figure turned its head, its faceless void somehow conveying a sense of amusement. Beyond the walls, it whispered, its voice echoing through the emptiness. Beyond the building, beyond reality, it gestured with the cigarette towards the nothingness. This is where we exist, it continued, in the spaces between, in the moments between, in the unseen. I didn't understand. Who are you? The figure chuckled, a dry, rustling sound that made my skin crawl. We are the forgotten, it whispered, the discarded, the left behind. We are the echoes of what was, and the whispers of what might be. It took a drag from the cigarette, the orange glow intensifying, illuminating the void where its face should have been. And you, Joe, it said, exhaling a plume of smoke that dissipated into the nothingness. You are a key, I repeated, my voice echoing strangely in the vast emptiness. A key to what? The figure took another step closer, the smoke from its cigarette swirling around me, filling my nostrils with its acrid scent. A key to understanding, it whispered. A key to acceptance. A key to joining us. Join them? Become one of them? A faceless, nameless entity, existing in the spaces between realities? Terror, raw and primal, surged through me. I wanted to run, to scream, to fight, but there was nowhere to run, nothing to fight. I was surrounded by nothingness, by the infinite void. No, I said, my voice trembling. I don't want this. The figure chuckled again, that dry, rustling sound that seemed to scrape against my very soul. You have no choice, Joe, it whispered. You opened the door. You followed the signs. You sought the answers. And now, you have found them. It raised its arm, pointing the cigarette at me. The orange glow intensified, becoming brighter, hotter. You see us, Joe, it said. You hear us. You know us. And that makes you one of us. I felt a pressure building inside me, a strange, pulling sensation, as if something were trying to extract itself from my body, to leave me behind, to join the figure in the void. I closed my eyes, fighting against the pressure, against the pull, against the inevitable. I thought of my life, of my mundane, ordinary existence, of the things I had taken for granted. The smell of coffee in the morning, the feel of sunshine on my skin, the sound of laughter, the touch of another human being. I didn't want to lose that. I didn't want to become nothing. I focused all my will, all my energy on resisting, on holding on refusing to be consumed by the void. I opened my eyes. The figure was still there, still pointing the cigarette at me, but the orange glow was fading. The pressure was lessening. The whispers were quieter. I realized, with a surge of desperate hope, that I could fight it. I could resist. I didn't know how, I didn't know why, but I had a power, a strength that the figure hadn't anticipated. The power of being human, of wanting, of living. No, I said, my voice stronger now, firmer. I don't belong here. I'm not one of you. The figure's form flickered, wavered, as if struggling to maintain its shape. You cannot resist, it whispered, his voice weaker now, strained. I can, I said, and I will. I took a step back, away from the figure, away from the void, and then another step, and another. The figure didn't follow. It just stood there, its form flickering, its orange glow dimming, its whispers fading. I turned and walked away, into the nothingness, trusting my instincts, my will, my humanity to guide me. I walked for what felt like an eternity, surrounded by darkness, by silence, by the void. Then I saw it, a faint light in the distance, a small, flickering light, like a candle in the wind. I walked towards it, my steps growing faster, my hope surging. The light grew brighter, larger, until it filled my vision. And then I was back. I was standing in the hallway of the 20th floor, outside the service elevator. The doors were closed. The floor indicator displayed 20. The air was normal, the lighting was normal, the building was normal. The figure was gone. The void was gone. The cigarette smoke was gone. I looked at my watch. 10:52 p.m. I had been gone for hours, days. Time had no meaning in that place. I staggered back to the security office, my legs weak, my body trembling. I sat down heavily in the chair, staring at the security monitors. Everything was normal, ordinary, but I knew it wasn't. I knew what lurked beyond the walls, beyond the floors, beyond the reality we perceive. I knew about the forgotten, the discarded, the left behind. And I knew that they were always there, waiting, watching, whispering. I quit my job the next day, handing in my resignation without explanation. I couldn't face going back to that building, to that floor, to that place. I moved away, far away, to a small town in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nature, by life, by reality. I tried to forget what had happened, to put it behind me, to move on with my life. But the memory, the experience, remained. It had changed me, fundamentally, irrevocably. I started seeing things, fleeting glimpses of shadows, of figures, in my peripheral vision. I would hear whispers in the silence, faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from inside my own head. I started smoking, Marlboro Reds. I didn't know why. I had never smoked before, but the smell, the taste, the feel of the cigarette between my fingers, it was comforting, familiar. I knew I was walking a dangerous path, that I was teetering on the edge of something I didn't understand, something I couldn't control. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth outside my bedroom door. I knew who it was. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked to the door and opened it. Standing in the hallway was the figure, the faceless smoker. It held out a cigarette, offering it to me, and this time I took it. The story stops, intentionally, at a point of decision and ambiguity. It does so to reflect the endless, unresolved nature and the lingering presence. The midnight shift at Riverside Commerce. Jonathan Albright hated working late, but deadlines were deadlines. As a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm housed in the sprawling Riverside Commerce Building, he often found himself alone in the fluorescent-lit labyrinth of cubicles long after everyone else had gone home. The Riverside Building was a relic of a bygone era, a former textile mill from the 1920s that had been repurposed into office space. It retained a certain gritty charm, with its exposed brick walls and high ceilings, but it also retained its quirks. On this particular Tuesday, October 15th, Jonathan was racing against the clock. His supervisor, the perpetually stressed Mr. Henderson, needed the quarterly reports by 9 a.m. sharp. The cleaning crew had long since departed, leaving the building eerily silent save for the rhythmic ticking and popping of the ancient heating system, a sound that always made Jonathan think of restless spirits. He'd been hunched over his computer since 8 p.m., fueled by vending machine coffee and a dwindling supply of stale granola bars. The digital clock on his monitor showed 11:42 p.m. when the first bang echoed through the empty office. Jonathan jumped, nearly knocking over his lukewarm coffee. The sound had come from down the hall, near the storage room, a room he'd always found vaguely unsettling. The storage room, just the thought of it sent a shiver down his spine. It was a holdover from the building's factory days, a cavernous space with a heavy oak door, a brass handle that was always cold to the touch, and a perpetual air of disuse. They kept old files, obsolete equipment, and the detritus of past businesses in there. Jonathan had only been inside once, during his initial office tour with Mr. Henderson, and the experience had left him with an inexplicable sense of unease. The bang came again, louder this time, more insistent. It sounded like someone was trapped inside, desperately trying to get out. But that was impossible. The door was always locked, and Jonathan had the only key on this floor, a heavy, ornate brass key that Mr. Henderson had entrusted to him with a grave warning about emergencies only. He reached for his phone, intending to call building security, then remembered. Budget cuts. The night guard now only patrolled the ground floor, leaving the upper levels to the ghosts and the shadows. The banging continued, rhythmic and desperate. Bang, bang, bang. What if someone was actually trapped inside? Maybe one of the cleaning staff had accidentally locked themselves in. Jonathan couldn't just ignore it. He stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor, the sound amplified in the silence. He walked slowly down the dimly lit hallway, his footsteps echoing on the worn carpet. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance in his peripheral vision. The banging grew louder as he approached the storage room door. His hands were slick with sweat as he pulled out the key. The brass handle felt like ice under his fingers. He turned the key, and the old lock clicked open with a loud thunk. The banging stopped instantly. "Hello," Jonathan called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone in there?" He pushed the door open. The storage room was plunged into absolute darkness. Jonathan fumbled for the light switch, his fingers tracing the cold, damp wall. When he found it, the fluorescent tubes flickered to life with a buzzing sound, illuminating a scene that made his breath catch in his throat. Empty. The room was completely, utterly empty of people. Rows of metal filing cabinets stretched into the darkness, their drawers slightly ajar like gaping mouths. Cardboard boxes, overflowing with forgotten paperwork, were stacked haphazardly to the ceiling. Old office furniture, desks, chairs, even a rusty coat rack was shrouded in dust sheets, giving them the appearance of ghostly figures. But something was profoundly wrong. The air, which had been comfortably cool in the hallway, was frigid in the storage room, felt like stepping into a walk-in freezer. A musty, almost suffocating odor hung in the air, a smell Jonathan couldn't quite place, like wet cardboard, decaying leaves, and something else, something faintly metallic. He could see his breath forming white clouds in front of his face. His skin prickled with goosebumps. He took a tentative step inside, his shoes crunching on something brittle. Looking down, he saw a thin layer of frost coating the concrete floor. Frost, in October, inside a heated building. It was impossible. He could hear the radiator ticking in the hallway behind him, a stark reminder of the normal temperature just a few feet away. This was something else. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him. Jonathan spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. He grabbed the brass handle, turning it frantically. It wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, rattling the door in its frame, but it was locked. Somehow, impossibly, locked. He checked the key, still clutched in his hand. It was the right key, the only key, but when he tried to insert it back into the lock, it wouldn't fit. It was as if the lock itself had changed shape, subtly but decisively. Panic began to claw at the edges of his mind. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen. No signal. Of course, the storage room's thick concrete walls had always been notorious for blocking reception. He'd experienced it himself during that initial tour with Mr. Henderson. He was trapped. A slight movement caught his eye. He turned, his flashlight beam sweeping across the rows of filing cabinets. Nothing, just the dust sheets, hanging still and silent. But then he saw it again. A subtle ripple in one of the dust sheets, as if disturbed by a breeze. There was no breeze in here.
No vents.
No windows, no possible source of air movement. The temperature dropped again, noticeably. The frost on the floor spread, crackling like thin ice underfoot. Jonathan's teeth began to chatter. He could feel the cold seeping through the soles of his shoes, numbing his feet. Bang! The sound came from inside one of the filing cabinets, close to where he was standing. Then another bang, from a different cabinet, and another, and another. All around the room, metal drawers began to shake and rattle, a cacophony of metallic groans and crashes that reverberated in the enclosed space. Jonathan backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs, his eyes darting around the room. He tried the door handle again, desperately, uselessly, still locked. The banging grew louder, faster, more frantic. Dust sheets began to flutter and billow, as if caught in a violent storm. Papers flew out of the boxes, swirling in the air like a miniature tornado. The fluorescent lights flickered faster, turning the room into a strobe-lit nightmare of shifting shadows and distorted shapes. In one fleeting flash of light, Jonathan saw it. The figure, standing at the far end of the room, near the back wall. Tall, impossibly tall. Its head almost brushed the ceiling. In the next flash, it was closer, and the next closer still. Jonathan couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even blink. He was frozen, a statue of pure terror, as the figure advanced with each strobe-like flicker of the dying fluorescent lights. The cold was now a physical presence, a crushing weight on his chest that made each breath a painful struggle. The figure's form was wrong. Limbs that were too long, joints that bent at unnatural angles, a posture that defied the normal laws of human anatomy. With each flash, it drew nearer, its grotesque silhouette growing larger, more menacing. He could smell it now, an intensification of that earlier, unsettling odor. It was the smell of decay, of ancient dust and something indescribably foul, like the exhalation of a tomb long sealed. Flash, 10 feet away. He could see now that where its face should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin stretched taut over bone. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank, featureless expanse. Flash, 5 feet away. A hand, or something resembling a hand, reached out towards him. The fingers were elongated, skeletal, ending in points that looked sharper than any razor. Flash, 3 feet away. The lights flickered one last time, revealing the figure looming over him, its blank face inches from his own. He could feel its presence, a cold, suffocating void that seemed to drain the very life from him. The lights went out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Jonathan felt something cold and clammy brush against his cheek. A whisper, barely audible, slithered into his ear. A voice that sounded like dry leaves rustling across pavement. "You shouldn't be here." A scream, raw and primal, tore from his throat. His paralysis broke. He slammed himself against the storage room door with all his remaining strength, a desperate, instinctive act of self-preservation. The door burst open, sending him sprawling onto the hallway floor. He scrambled to his feet, not daring to look back, and ran. He ran as if all the demons of hell were chasing him, his footsteps echoing in the now silent hallway. He didn't stop until he reached his car in the deserted parking lot, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at work late, his face pale and drawn, his eyes bloodshot. Mr. Henderson was furious about the missing quarterly reports, but Jonathan couldn't bring himself to care. He walked straight to the storage room, his heart pounding in his chest. The door was locked, just as it always was. He unlocked it, his hand trembling. Everything inside was exactly as it should be. No frost, no scattered papers, no sign of the previous night's terror. The temperature was normal. The air smelled faintly of dust, but nothing more. But the smell, it lingered, faint but unmistakable, a ghost of that overwhelming stench of decay. And when he checked the security footage from the previous night, hoping against hope for some confirmation of what he'd experienced, he found that the cameras in that section of the building had mysteriously stopped recording between 11:40 p.m. and 12:15 a.m. Just static. Jonathan gave his 2 weeks' notice that afternoon. He couldn't face another night in that building, another shift haunted by the memory of that cold, that banging, that thing in the storage room. He found a new job, a smaller firm across town, in a modern office building with bright lights and plenty of people around, even during the late hours. But the nightmares followed him. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, his heart racing, the smell of decay still clinging to his nostrils. He'd see that tall, impossibly thin figure in his dreams, its blank face looming over him, its skeletal hand reaching out. Sometimes, when working late at his new office, he'd hear a faint knocking sound, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from inside the walls. He knew it was just the building settling, or the pipes expanding and contracting, but his body would react involuntarily, his muscles tensing, his breath catching in his throat. He'd quickly pack up his things and leave, the fear a cold knot in his stomach. He tried to talk about it once with a coworker, Sarah. He described the storage room, the cold, the banging, the figure. She listened patiently, then suggested he might be suffering from stress-induced hallucinations. She recommended a therapist. Jonathan didn't bother. He knew what he'd seen, what he'd felt. He knew that some things defied rational explanation. He started researching the history of the Riverside Commerce Building, spending hours online, digging through old newspaper archives and local history forums. He found stories of accidents, of unexplained disappearances, of workers complaining about strange sounds and unsettling feelings in certain parts of the building, particularly the old storage room. One story from the 1950s caught his attention. A night watchman had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his keys and a half-eaten sandwich in the break room. The police investigation had turned up nothing. The case remained unsolved. Jonathan started driving past his old office building late at night, after his shifts at the new firm. He'd park across the street and watch the windows, most of them dark, reflecting the city lights. Occasionally, he'd see a light on in one of the offices, someone working late just like he used to. And sometimes, just sometimes, he thought he saw a shadow move behind those lit windows, a tall, thin shadow that didn't quite look human, a shadow that seemed to stretch and distort in ways that defied the laws of physics. He wanted to warn them, to tell them to go home before it got too dark, to tell them to avoid the storage room, to never, ever unlock that heavy oak door. But who would believe him? He was just the crazy guy who quit his job because he was afraid of shadows. So he'd drive on, the image of that figure burned into his memory, the smell of decay still clinging to his clothes, the sound of that whisper, "You shouldn't be here," echoing in his ears. He knew the truth about old buildings and empty rooms. They weren't always as empty as they seemed, and sometimes the things that were locked away for a very good reason. He knew now. He just wished he hadn't learned it the hard way. The key, he realized, was to never investigate. Ever. The thrifter's curse. Beatrice B. Du Bois had a knack for finding treasures in the unlikeliest of places. As a sorter at Second Chance Goods, a sprawling thrift store on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, she sifted through mountains of donated cast-offs every day. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and occasionally, she'd unearth something truly special. That Tuesday started like any other. Piles of overflowing garbage bags, filled with the discarded belongings of strangers, were dumped at the back loading dock overnight. BA's job was to separate the wheat from the chaff, the items that could be salvaged and sold from the ones destined for the landfill. The coat was unremarkable at first glance. Brown wool, probably from the 1970s, with worn elbows and a ripped lining. The kind of thing B would usually toss into the reject pile without a second thought. But something made her pause. She checked the pockets, a routine habit. You'd be surprised what people forgot. Crumpled receipts, loose change, sometimes even jewelry or small, forgotten treasures. Her fingers brushed against paper. Not a receipt, not a shopping list. She pulled it out. It was a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and creased from years of being tucked away. 5 words were scrawled across it in a messy, urgent hand. "He is watching you now." A chill ran down BA's spine, despite the stuffy air of the sorting room. She looked around, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. But the room was empty, just rows of overflowing bins and discarded clothes. "Get a grip, B," she muttered to herself. It was just a stupid note, probably some kid's prank. She crumpled the paper, intending to toss it into the nearby trash can, but her hand hesitated. Something about those words, the intensity of the handwriting, the sheer wrongness of finding them in an old coat pocket. It unnerved her. She smoothed out the paper, her fingers tracing the jagged letters. Against her better judgment, she slipped it into her own pocket. The rest of her shift crawled by. Every few minutes, her hand would drift to her pocket, touching the note through the fabric of her jeans. She found herself glancing over her shoulder repeatedly, a growing sense of unease settling in her stomach. By the time she clocked out at 6 p.m., she was jumpy and irritable, rushing to her beat-up Honda Civic without her usual friendly goodbye to her coworker, Carlos. The drive home was uneventful. The autumn sky was darkening, the streetlights flickering to life as she pulled into the gravel driveway of her small bungalow on the edge of town. Bea usually loved the quiet solitude of her home, but tonight, the silence felt oppressive, watchful. She went through her usual evening routine, kicked off her shoes, microwaved leftovers, grabbed a bottle of soda from the fridge, and settled down on the couch to watch TV. But she couldn't focus. The note was still in her pocket, a tangible weight against her leg. Finally, she pulled it out, smoothing it on the coffee table. The 5 words stared up at her, stark and unsettling in the lamplight. "He is watching you now." The first knock came at precisely 8:47 p.m. 3 sharp, distinct raps on her back door. Bea froze, the remote control slipping from her hand. The TV, tuned to some mindless reality show, blared in the sudden silence. Nobody ever used that door. It opened onto her small, fenced-in backyard, accessible only through a gate that Bea always kept locked. She waited, holding her breath, listening. Nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant drone of traffic from the main road. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Harder this time, more insistent. Bea stood up slowly, her legs feeling strangely weak. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice a shaky whisper that barely reached the door. No answer. She crept towards the kitchen, keeping her distance from the windows. The back door was solid wood, with no peephole or window. She couldn't see who or what was on the other side. The knocking came again, right in front of her, so close she could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. Bang, bang, bang. Bea stumbled backward, bumping into the kitchen counter, a gasp escaping her lips. "This isn't funny," she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. "I'm calling the police." She grabbed her phone from her pocket, her fingers fumbling with the keypad. As she dialed 911, A new sound made her blood run cold. A slow, deliberate scraping against the door, like nails or claws being dragged down the wood. The sound went on and on, setting her teeth on edge, a grating, visceral noise that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. The 911 operator answered, her voice calm and professional. Bea tried to explain, stammering about the knocking, the scratching, the feeling of being watched. But halfway through her frantic explanation, the sounds stopped. Abruptly, completely, silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the operator's voice asking if she was still there. I think they're gone, Bea whispered, her voice trembling. I'm sorry. Maybe it was just kids playing a prank. She knew it wasn't kids. The scratching had come from too high up on the door, and the rhythm of those knocks. It had felt deliberate, patient, like whatever was out there had all the time in the world. She spent the next hour checking every door and window in her house, making sure they were locked and secured. She drew all the curtains, turning her cozy bungalow into a brightly lit fortress. The note, crumpled and forgotten, lay on the coffee table. She should have thrown it out already. She finally picked it up, smoothing it out again. The 5 words seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. He is watching you now. As she stared at the note, a sound from upstairs made her freeze. Footsteps, slow, heavy, creaking across the floorboards of her bedroom. But Bea lived in a single-story bungalow. There was no upstairs. Ba's blood turned to ice. The footsteps continued, slow and measured, each creak echoing through the silent house. They were coming from a place that didn't exist, a phantom second story, conjured out of thin air. She grabbed her keys and her phone, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold them. She had to get out. Now, she yanked open the front door, ready to flee into the night, and stopped dead. All the lights on her street were out. Not just the porch lights, not just the house lights, the street lights were dark, too. An unnatural, inky blackness pressed against her doorway, a void that seemed to swallow all light and sound. The footsteps upstairs were getting closer, descending a staircase that shouldn't be there, each creak bringing them nearer, heavier, more real. Bea slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling fingers. She backed away, her eyes wide with terror. She was trapped. She ran to the kitchen, her mind racing. The back door. She had to get out the back door. But as she reached for the knob, she saw it. The kitchen door, the one she knew she'd locked earlier, was standing wide open. A cold, damp breeze flowed in, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something else. Something decaying, like rotting leaves and stagnant water. Beyond the doorway, there was nothing but blackness, an absolute, impenetrable darkness that seemed to absorb all light. The footsteps reached the bottom of the imaginary stairs. They started down her hallway, slow and steady, each step making the floor vibrate under her feet. Bea backed away from the open door, bumping into the kitchen counter. Her phone was still in her hand. She could call 911 again, call someone, anyone. But when she looked at the screen, it was black. Not just turned off, but black, as if the screen itself had been filled with ink, a swirling, viscous darkness that shifted and pulsed as she watched. The footsteps reached the kitchen doorway. Bea couldn't look. She didn't want to see what was making those heavy, deliberate steps. But her eyes were drawn upwards, against her will. Nothing. The doorway was empty, but the footsteps kept coming, crossing the tiled kitchen floor, getting closer, closer. The note, it was still clutched in her other hand, crumpled into a tight ball. With shaking fingers, she uncurled the paper, smoothing it out. The words had changed. Told you so. Something cold brushed against her shoulder. A hand, but wrong. Too many fingers. Too long. Too cold. She spun around and woke up. Bea was lying on her kitchen floor, sunlight streaming through the windows. The back door was closed and locked. Her phone lay beside her, the screen displaying her home screen, perfectly normal. Everything looked exactly as it should, except deep scratches, gouged into the wooden surface of her kitchen door, marred the otherwise smooth finish. Scratches that hadn't been there the day before, except muddy footprints, impossibly large and strangely shaped, tracked across her clean tile floor, leading from the back door towards where she'd been lying. Footprints that couldn't possibly belong to any human, except the note. The crumpled piece of paper was gone. In its place, scattered across the kitchen counter, were tiny, shredded fragments of yellowed paper, too small to piece together, too small to read, be called in sick to work. She spent the morning in a daze, trying to convince herself it had all been a nightmare, a vivid hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But the scratches on the door, the muddy footprints, the shredded remains of the note, they were undeniable proof that something had happened. She tried to go back to her normal routine, but the fear lingered, a constant shadow at the edges of her mind. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside her window, made her jump. She found herself checking over her shoulder constantly, half expecting to see that thing standing behind her. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her living room, every light blazing, listening, waiting. Around 11 p.m., she heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from under the house. From the crawl space, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It moved slowly, deliberately, towards the access panel in her hallway floor. The metal panel began to rattle, vibrating with the force of something pushing up from below. Bea knew what was happening. She knew she should run, get out of the house, drive as far away as possible. But she was frozen, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and a strange, morbid curiosity. The access panel burst open with a loud clang, the metal hinges snapping. A dark shape began to pull itself out of the crawl space, joints cracking, limbs unfolding in ways that shouldn't be possible. Heavy footsteps echoed in her hallway, coming closer, closer. Bea closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She knew what was coming. She knew she should have thrown that note away, should have burned it, should have never read those 5 cursed words. The footsteps stopped right outside her living room. She could smell that familiar scent of wet earth and decay, stronger now than ever before. She could hear breathing, slow and raspy, that wasn't her own. She opened her eyes, and there, standing in her living room, was nothing, empty space. But she could feel it, presence, cold, malevolent, watching, a whisper, so faint she almost imagined it, brushed against her ear. Now he is behind you. And with that she felt a cold breeze, a cold hand on her shoulder. She had to run now. The calls from apartment 7. The call came in at precisely 2 a.m., a shrill ring that shattered the quiet of the dispatch office. Officer Rebecca Beck Johnson, had been a 911 operator for 5 years, long enough to have heard it all: domestic disputes, medical emergencies, drunk drivers, and the occasional cat stuck in a tree. But this call, this was different. The caller ID displayed blocked number. That wasn't unusual. But the voice on the other end, it was a child's voice, small and frightened, barely a whisper. "Hello?" the child said, their voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" "This is 911, I replied, my voice calm and reassuring. "What's your emergency?" Silence. Then a soft sob. "Hello," I repeated. "Can you tell me your name and address?" I don't know," the child whispered. I'm scared." "It's okay," I said. "Just tell me what's happening. Are you hurt?" There's someone in the house," the child said, their voice barely audible above the static on the line. "I can hear them walking around." My heart rate accelerated. This was a possible home invasion, a child in danger. "Are you alone?" I asked, my fingers flying across the keyboard, entering the information into the dispatch system. "Yes," the child whispered. My mommy's gone." "Okay," I said. "Stay on the line with me. Don't hang up. I'm sending officers to your location. Can you tell me what you see? What you hear?" I'm hiding," the child said. "In the closet." I can hear footsteps, heavy footsteps, and whispering. I can't understand what they're saying. I tried to trace the call to pinpoint the child's location, but it was no use. The number was blocked, the signal untraceable. Just stay on the line with me, I repeated, my voice urgent. The officers are on their way. They'll be there soon. I could hear the child's breathing, rapid and shallow, punctuated by soft sobs. I could hear the faint creak of floorboards, the rustling of something. Then a new sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from inside the closet itself. What was that? I asked, my blood running cold. What did you hear? The child screamed, a high-pitched, terrified scream that cut through the static like a knife. Then silence. The line went dead. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, the child's scream echoing in my ears. I tried to call back, but the number was unreachable. I dispatched officers to the general vicinity, based on the faint cell tower ping I had managed to get before the call dropped. But it was a long shot. It covered a radius of several miles, encompassing hundreds of homes, apartments, and businesses. I felt a surge of helplessness, of frustration, of fear. I had failed. I had failed to protect that child. I had failed to save them. The next few hours were a blur. I continued to take calls, to dispatch officers, to deal with the mundane and the extraordinary. But my mind kept returning to that child, to that scream, to that silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened, something that went beyond a simple home invasion. The officers I had dispatched searched the area, going door to door, checking every house, every apartment, every building. They found nothing. No sign of a child in distress, no evidence of a break-in, no witnesses. The call was eventually classified as unfounded. A prank, a hoax, a mistake. But I knew it wasn't a mistake. I knew that child had been in real danger, and I knew that I had failed them. I went home that morning, exhausted and defeated, the child's scream still ringing in my ears. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that child's face, heard their terrified whisper, felt their fear. I started researching, digging through old case files, searching for similar calls, for unexplained disappearances, for anything that could shed light on what had happened. I found nothing. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The call, the child, the scream, faded into the background, becoming just another unsolved mystery, another unanswered question in the vast, chaotic world of 911 dispatch. But I never forgot. Then, one night, almost a year later, it happened again. The same shrill ring, the same blocked number, and the same voice, a child's voice, small and frightened, barely a whisper. Hello? Is anyone there? My blood ran cold. I froze, my hand hovering over the keyboard, my mind racing. Couldn't be. It was impossible. But it was the same voice. I was sure of it. The same tremor, the same fear, the same desperation. This is 911, I replied, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the turmoil raging inside me. What's your emergency? The child hesitated, then whispered, I'm scared. It was the exact same words, the exact same phrasing as the call from a year ago. It's okay, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard, trying to trace the call, trying to pinpoint the location. Just tell me what's happening. Are you hurt? There's someone in the house. The child whispered. I can hear them walking around.
Déjà vu.
A chilling, terrifying sense of repetition washed over me. This was the same call, the same nightmare, playing out again. Are you alone? I asked, my voice urgent. Yes, the child whispered. My mommy's gone. Okay, I said. Stay on the line with me. Don't hang up. I'm sending officers to your location. Can you tell me what you see? What you hear? I'm hiding, the child said. In the closet. I can hear footsteps, heavy footsteps, and whispering. I can't understand what they're saying. The same words, the same scenario, the same terror. But this time I was prepared. I immediately dispatched officers, giving them the same general vicinity as before, but adding a crucial detail. Check all vacant properties, abandoned buildings, foreclosed homes. Focus on any location that might be unoccupied. I knew with a certainty that defied logic that the child wasn't in a normal home, a normal apartment. They were somewhere else, somewhere lost. I stayed on the line with the child, talking to them, reassuring them, trying to keep them calm, trying to glean any new information, any clue that could help the officers find them. But the call played out exactly as it had before. The footsteps, the whispering, the growl, the scream, the silence. The line went dead. I slammed my fist on the desk, a surge of frustration and anger coursing through me. I had failed again. I had let that child down again. But this time, I wasn't going to give up. I wasn't going to let it become another unsolved mystery, another unanswered question. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, listening to the police radio, praying for any news, any sign of the child. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence in the dispatch office was deafening, broken only by the hum of the computers and the occasional chatter of other operators. Then, a voice crackled over the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. We have a situation." My breath caught in my throat. "Unit 7, go ahead. We're at 14 Maple Street, the old abandoned Miller House. We found something. The Miller House. It was a notorious local landmark, a crumbling Victorian mansion that had been vacant for decades. It was rumored to be haunted, a place where teenagers dared each other to spend the night, a place where strange things were said to happen. What did you find, Unit 7? I asked, my voice trembling. There was a long pause, then the officer's voice, hesitant, uncertain. "We found a phone, an old rotary phone. It's ringing." "A rotary phone? Ringing? In an abandoned house with no phone service? Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "No, ma'am," the officer replied. "Just the phone, ringing, and there's a message, written on the wall in what looks like blood." My blood ran cold. "What does the message say, Unit 7? Another long pause. Then, the officer's voice, filled with a chilling dread. It says, "Help me. Apartment 7. Apartment 7. The Miller House had never been an apartment building. It had been a single-family home, a mansion once upon a time. But I knew with a certainty that defied logic that Apartment 7 was the key. The key to the child, the key to the calls, the key to the mystery. I had to go there. I had to see it for myself. I told my supervisor I was taking a break, grabbed my coat, and practically ran out of the dispatch office. I jumped in my car and sped towards 14 Maple Street, my mind racing, my heart pounding. The Miller House loomed before me, a dark, silhouetted shape against the night sky. It was a crumbling Victorian mansion, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling, its porch sagging. It exuded an aura of decay, of neglect, of something else, something sinister. Police cars were parked out front, their red and blue lights flashing, casting eerie shadows on the overgrown lawn. I parked behind them, got out of my car, and approached the house. Officer Miller, a young, fresh-faced officer I recognized from previous calls, met me at the front door. "Officer Johnson," he said, his expression grim. "You shouldn't be here. This is a crime scene." "I know," I said, "but I need to see it. I need to see Apartment 7. Miller hesitated, then nodded slowly. It's upstairs," he said. "Second floor, at the end of the hall." He led me inside, the house silent except for the creaking of floorboards and the distant murmur of police radios. The air was cold, damp, with a faint, musty odor that made my stomach churn. We climbed the stairs, the wood groaning under our weight. The second floor was a maze of dark, empty rooms, filled with cobwebs and dust. We reached the end of the hall, A door stood ajar, a single, bare light bulb illuminating the room beyond. On the door, painted in what looked like dried blood, was a number, 7. This was it, apartment 7. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Then, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, bare, and utterly unremarkable. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floorboards were warped and stained, and the single window was boarded up, blocking out any natural light. The only object in the room was an old rotary phone, sitting on a small, dusty table in the corner. The phone was black, its cord frayed and tangled. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but it was ringing, a shrill, insistent ring that echoed through the silent room, a sound that seemed to come from another time, another place. I approached the phone slowly, cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out, my hand trembling, and picked up the receiver. Silence. Then, a faint whisper, barely audible. "Help me." It was the child's voice, the same voice I had heard on the calls. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Who is this?" The whisper continued, growing slightly louder, more distinct. "Apartment 7, they took me. They're coming back." "Who took you?" Pressed. "Who's coming back?" But there was no answer, just the faint, persistent whisper, repeating the same words over and over again. "Help me, apartment 7, they took me. They're coming back." I looked around the room, searching for any clue, any sign of the child, of who had taken them, of what had happened here. Then I saw it, scratched into the wall, near the floor, barely visible in the dim light, were a series of marks. They were small, childlike, as if made by someone's fingernails. I knelt down, examining them closely. They weren't random scratches. They were words, a message. I could make out a few letters, a few fragments of words. Trapped, time loop, 1987, 1987. That was the year the Miller house had been abandoned, after the last remaining member of the family, a young girl named Emily, had disappeared without a trace. The case had never been solved. I realized, with a chilling certainty, that I was talking to Emily. Somehow, someway, her voice, her plea for help, was trapped in this room, in this phone, echoing across the decades. And the calls weren't coming from the present. They were coming from the past. I was talking to a ghost trapped in a time loop, reliving her final moments over and over again. But how was this possible? How could a phone in an abandoned house with no phone line be receiving calls from the past? And who were they? The ones who had taken her? The ones who were coming back? I remembered the growl I had heard on the calls, the heavy footsteps, the whispering. It wasn't human. It was something else. Something that had been in the Miller house in 1987. Something that was still there, trapped in the time loop with Emily. Something that was hunting her. I had to help her. I had to break the cycle. I had to find a way to free her. But how? I looked at the phone, at the scratched message on the wall, at the empty room. The answer had to be here somewhere. Then, I noticed something else. On the table next to the phone was a small, dusty book. It was a diary. I picked it up, carefully opening its fragile pages. The handwriting was childish, scrawling, but legible. The first entry was dated June 12, 1987. "Dear Diary," it read. "Today was my birthday. I turned 10. Mommy gave me this diary. She said I could write down all my secrets in it." I flipped through the pages, reading the entries. They were the typical musings of a young girl, her friends, her school, her crushes, her dreams. But as I read further, the entries became darker, more disturbing. Emily wrote about strange noises in the house, about feeling watched, about seeing shadows moving in the corners of her eyes. She wrote about nightmares, terrifying dreams of a tall, dark figure with no face. She wrote about a game she played with her imaginary friend, a game called Hide and Seek in the Dark, a game where she would hide in the closet, and her friend would try to find her, a game that was becoming too real, The last entry was dated July 15th, 1987. Dear Diary, it read,
I'm scared.
"The noises are getting louder. The shadows are getting closer. My friend, he's not imaginary anymore. He's here, in the house. He's coming for me. I'm hiding in the closet. I can hear him whispering. He knows my name. He says, 'It's time to play.'" The diary ended there. I closed the book, my hands trembling. I knew what had happened. Emily hadn't disappeared. She had been taken. By the creature from her nightmares, by the friend in her game, by the thing that was still trapped in this house, in this time loop. And the phone calls, they were her cries for help, echoing across the decades, reaching out to anyone who could hear them. I had to break the cycle. I had to free Emily, and I had to stop the creature. I knew what I had to do. I had to play the game. I put the diary back on the table next to the phone. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was insane. This was reckless. This was probably suicidal. But I had no choice. I had to try. I walked to the closet, the same closet Emily had described in her diary. It was small, dark, and smelled of dust and mildew. I opened the door and stepped inside, closing it behind me. The darkness was absolute. I couldn't see anything, not even my own hand in front of my face. I stood there, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence was deafening, broken only by my own ragged breathing. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, seemingly coming from the walls themselves. "Emily." It was the same voice I had heard on the calls, the same voice that had haunted my dreams. But this time it wasn't a child's voice. It was deeper, darker, more menacing. "Are you ready to play?" I didn't answer. I just stood there, waiting, listening. The whispering continued, growing louder, closer. I could hear footsteps now, heavy footsteps, pacing back and forth outside the closet. "I know you're in there, Emily," the voice said, a hint of mockery in its tone. "You can't hide from me." I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, a sensation that made my skin crawl. I could feel the presence of the creature, just outside the closet door, its darkness pressing against the thin wood. "It's time to come out, Emily," the voice whispered. "It's time to play." The closet door creaked open. I braced myself, ready to face whatever was on the other side. But there was nothing there, just the empty room, bathed in the faint glow of the light bulb. The phone was ringing. I stepped out of the closet, my legs weak and unsteady. I walked to the table and picked up the receiver. Silence. Then, a faint whisper, barely audible. "Help me." It was Emily's voice, but this time it was different. It was clearer, stronger, and it wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from behind me. I turned around. Standing in the center of the room was a young girl. She was pale, translucent, almost glowing. She was wearing a white dress, and her long, dark hair framed her face. She looked sad and scared. "Emily?" I asked, my voice trembling. She nodded slowly. I'm here to help you," I said. "I'm here to break the cycle." She looked at me, her eyes wide and hopeful. Can you really do that?" she whispered. "I'm going to try," I said, "but I need your help. I need you to tell me what happened." Emily hesitated, then began to speak. She told me about the game, about the imaginary friend, about the darkness that had crept into her life, slowly, insidiously, until it had consumed her. She told me about the creature, about how it had taken her, about how it had trapped her in this room, in this time loop, forcing her to relive her final moments over and over again. She told me about the only way to break the cycle. "You have to destroy it," she said. "You have to end the game. Destroy it." I asked, "How?" Emily pointed to the closet. "The source," she whispered. "It's in there. The darkness. It started there." I understood. The closet wasn't just a hiding place. It was a portal, a gateway, a connection to the creature's realm, to the source of its power. I had to go back in. I had to face the darkness again. But this time I wouldn't be alone. "I'll go with you," Emily said, her voice stronger now, filled with a newfound determination. "I know the way." We walked to the closet hand in hand. I opened the door and stepped inside, Emily following close behind. The darkness was absolute, but this time it was different. I could feel Emily's presence beside me, a faint warmth, a gentle light guiding me, protecting me. We walked for what felt like an eternity, through the darkness, through the silence, through the nothingness. Then we saw it, a light, a faint, flickering light in the distance. We walked towards it, our steps growing faster, our hope surging. The light grew brighter, larger, until it filled our vision. And then we were there. We were standing in a different version of the room. It was the same room, the same furniture, the same layout. But it was different. It was older. The wallpaper was faded and peeling. The floorboards were cracked and broken. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. And in the center of the room stood the creature. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs elongated and distorted, its head a featureless void. It was surrounded by a swirling vortex of darkness, a palpable aura of evil and malice. It turned its non-face towards us, non-eyes locking onto mine. It spoke. Its voice was a chorus of whispers, a cacophony of lost souls, a symphony of despair. "You cannot stop me," it hissed. "I am eternal. It's over," I said, my voice firm, despite the terror that threatened to consume me. "The game is over." I raised my hand, and in it I held the diary. Emily's diary, the record of her fear, her torment, her life. "This is her story," I said, "and it ends now." I opened the diary to the last entry, the one where Emily had written about her fear, about the creature, about the game. And I began to read, aloud, my voice echoing through the silent room. As I read, the creature began to writhe, to convulse, to scream. The darkness that surrounded it flickered, wavered, began to dissipate. Emily stood beside me, her hand in mine, her presence a source of strength and courage. I finished reading the entry, the last words, the last plea, the last hope. He says, "It's time to play." Then, silence. The creature was gone. The darkness was gone. The room was empty, except for Emily. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. You freed me." Then, she began to fade, her form becoming translucent, ethereal, until she was just a faint glow, a shimmering light. And then she was gone. I was alone, in the empty room, in the past. I stood there for a long moment, letting the silence wash over me, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. I had traveled through time, faced a creature of pure darkness, and freed a trapped soul. I closed the diary, my hands trembling. I knew I had to get back to my own time, to my own reality. But how? I looked around the room, searching for a clue, a sign, anything that could help me. Then I saw it. The closet. The same closet where Emily had hidden, the same closet that had served as a portal to the creature's realm. It was still there, still open. A dark, beckoning void. I knew it was a risk, a dangerous gamble, but it was my only chance. I took a deep breath and stepped back into the closet. The darkness enveloped me, absolute and complete. I felt a sensation of falling, of spinning, of being pulled through something. Then I landed, on solid ground. I opened my eyes. I was back in apartment 7 in the Miller house, the present day. The room was empty, the phone silent, the diary lying on the table where I had left it. The police were gone. The crime scene tape was gone. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had done. I knew what I had seen. I walked out of the room, out of the house, into the cool night air. I looked back at the crumbling Victorian mansion, its windows dark and empty. It was over. The time loop was broken. Emily was free. The creature was gone. But the memory, the experience would remain. It had changed me fundamentally, irrevocably. I returned to my job as a 911 operator, but I was different now. I listened to every call with a new intensity, a new understanding. I knew that behind every voice, behind every plea for help, there could be a story, a mystery, a darkness waiting to be uncovered. I knew that sometimes the most ordinary calls could lead to the most extraordinary and terrifying discoveries. And I knew that I would never forget Emily, the girl trapped in time, the voice on the phone, the ghost in apartment 7. The silence of the dispatch office was no longer just silence. It was a space filled with potential, with unseen connections, with the echoes of the past, waiting to be heard. And I was listening, always listening, for I am now a guardian of the boundary, and forever will the lost calls find their way to me. Capturing the beauty in the ruins, and sharing it with the world through their online blog, Rust Belt Relics. The old Hamilton manufacturing plant, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of Detroit, had been on their target list for months. It had shut down in 2008, leaving behind 5 acres of industrial wasteland, a monument to a bygone era. Liam, the group's de facto leader and resident history buff, remembered the exact moment they pulled up to the chain-link fence surrounding the complex. It was a Thursday night, late October. The factory's broken windows stared down at them like empty eye sockets, reflecting the weak, flickering security light above the loading dock. The building seemed to breathe in the darkness, the shadows shifting and swirling. Noah, always the comedian, grinned, his teeth flashing white in the gloom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, brandishing a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters, "dinner is served." He snipped through the fence with practiced ease, pulling back the metal to create an opening. Maya, ever the pragmatist, rolled her eyes. Real subtle, Noah. Chloe, already adjusting the settings on her high-end camera, was focused on the task at hand. "Remember, guys," Liam said, his voice low and serious, "we stick together, no wandering off alone. This place is huge, and it's been abandoned for over a decade. Safety first." He gave Chloe a pointed look. She was known for getting lost in her photography, sometimes to the detriment of her own well-being. Yeah, Chloe mumbled, already framing a shot of the factory's looming silhouette against the night sky. Teamwork makes the dream work, and all that. The autumn air bit through their jackets as they crossed the deserted parking lot. Weeds had forced their way through cracks in the asphalt, creating a treacherous maze underfoot. Their footsteps crunched on broken glass and loose gravel, the sound echoing off the factory walls, creating the unsettling illusion that someone was walking behind them. The main entrance was boarded up, but they found a broken window on the ground floor. Noah went first, clearing away any remaining shards of glass. Maya followed, then Chloe, and finally Liam, bringing up the rear. As he climbed through, his boot caught on the jagged edge of the window frame. He stumbled, sending an empty aluminum can skittering across the floor. The metallic clang reverberated through the silence. "Smooth, Liam," Noah whispered, his voice laced with sarcasm. Liam shot him a glare. "Shut it, Noah." The beam of his headlamp cut through the gloom. They were in what appeared to be an old break room. Trash and debris littered the floor. Crumpled papers, discarded food containers, a broken coffee mug. A row of rusted lockers lined one wall, their doors hanging open like slack jaws. The ceiling had partially collapsed in one corner, revealing a glimpse of the night sky. Maya walked over to one of the lockers, peering inside. "Check this out," she said, pulling something from the shadows. It was an old time card, yellowed and brittle with age. The date stamped on it was from 1986. "Wonder what happened to this guy. Probably retired to Florida," Noah quipped. "Or, became one with the building." They moved deeper into the factory, following what seemed to be the main corridor. Their headlamps illuminated peeling paint, exposed pipes, and the ghostly shapes of abandoned machinery. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay, a scent that clung to their clothes and made their throats feel scratchy. The layout was a confusing labyrinth of interconnected hallways and production areas. Liam kept consulting his phone, trying to match their location to a set of building plans he'd found online. After about 20 minutes, they reached a vast, open space that must have been the main production floor. The ceiling here soared at least 40 feet overhead, supported by massive steel beams. Rows of assembly lines stretched into the darkness, conveyor belts hanging limp like the shed skins of giant snakes. A network of catwalks crisscrossed the space high above, a skeletal framework against the dim light. "This is incredible," Maya breathed, her camera clicking rapidly. The scale of this place. Chloe was already climbing onto one of the conveyor belts, her agility surprising given her focus on photography. "Hey guys, I bet we can follow this thing and see where it goes." They spent the next hour exploring the production floor, documenting everything with photos and videos. Noah found an old control panel and pretended to operate it, making exaggerated machine noises and mimicking the sounds of a factory floor. Chloe discovered a collection of employee photos, still hanging on a bulletin board in what had once been a supervisor's office. The faces, frozen in time behind cloudy plastic, stared out at them with an eerie, almost accusatory gaze. It was when they decided to explore the second floor that the atmosphere began to shift, to take on a distinctly unsettling edge. The steel staircase leading to the second floor creaked ominously under their weight, each step echoing through the vast, empty space. At the top, the hallway split in two directions. "Left or right?" Noah asked, his usual jovial tone replaced by a hint of nervousness. Liam consulted the building plans on his phone. "Left should take us towards the administrative offices. Right goes to more production areas. Probably more of the same. Offices might have more interesting stuff," Maya suggested. "Documents, personal items, maybe even some old love letters." She winked at Chloe, who rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. They turned left. This corridor was narrower than the ones downstairs, the ceiling lower, creating a more claustrophobic feeling. Water damage was evident everywhere. The walls were bubbled and peeling, stained with patches of black mold that spread like malignant bruises. The offices were in a state of advanced decay. Years of exposure to the elements had reduced most of the furniture to rotting piles of wood and rusted metal. Paper lay scattered everywhere, turned to a pulpy, illegible mess by water and time. The few items that remained intact were coated in a thick layer of dust, giving them the appearance of ghostly artifacts. Chloe found an old desk calendar, still open to a page in October 1986. She photographed it, while Noah rummaged through the drawers of a filing cabinet, pulling out handfuls of dust and crumbling paper. Liam, meanwhile, was focused on capturing the overall atmosphere of decay, the way nature was slowly but surely reclaiming the space. He hung back slightly, scanning his light beam across the walls and ceiling. Something about this area felt different. The air seemed heavier, more oppressive. He noticed, with a growing unease, that the temperature had dropped several degrees. "Hey guys," he called out, his voice sounding strained even to his own ears. "Anyone else feel how cold it got up here?" Noah, halfway through pulling out a drawer filled with what looked like ancient payroll records, paused. "Yeah, now that you mention it, old buildings like this are always drafty," Maya said, not looking up from her camera. "Probably just a broken window somewhere." But Liam wasn't convinced. He'd explored dozens of abandoned buildings, and he'd never felt a temperature change this abrupt, this localized, felt unnatural. They continued moving through the offices, the corridor twisting and turning, leading them deeper into the heart of the building. Liam tried to keep track of their route, but the identical doorways and peeling walls all blurred together, making it impossible to maintain a sense of direction. After about 15 minutes, they reached another set of stairs, this one leading up to the third floor. A metal sign, barely legible under years of grime and rust, read, "Executive Offices." "Should we check it out?" Noah asked, his voice hesitant. Chloe looked at her watch. "We've been here almost 2 hours. Maybe we should start heading back." Come on, Liam said, a sudden, inexplicable urge to see what was up there overriding his earlier caution. We're already here. When are we going to get another chance? He knew he was pushing it, but something about that sign, about the idea of executive offices in this decaying ruin, intrigued him. Before anyone could respond, a loud crash echoed from somewhere behind them, down the corridor they just traversed. They all jumped, their headlamps swinging wildly, illuminating the empty hallway. What was that? Maya whispered, her voice tight with fear. Probably just something falling, Noah said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. These places are always settling. They stood there for a moment, listening, their hearts pounding. The only sound was their own breathing and the faint drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Let's just check out the third floor quickly, Liam said, his voice betraying his own unease. And then we head back. Agreed. No one argued. They climbed the stairs, the metal steps ringing hollow under their feet, the sound amplified in the confined space. At the top, they found themselves in a short hallway, ending in a set of imposing double doors. Brass letters, tarnished with age but still discernible, spelled out, boardroom. The doors were locked, but Noah, ever resourceful, produced a small pry bar from his backpack. He made quick work of the latch, the metal groaning in protest as it gave way. The doors swung inward with a slow, creaking sound that set Liam's teeth on edge. Their headlamps revealed a large, opulent room, a stark contrast to the decay they'd seen elsewhere in the factory. A massive mahogany table dominated the center of the space, its surface still gleaming faintly despite a layer of dust. The far wall was entirely made of glass, though most of the panes were broken or missing, offering a panoramic view of the factory complex below. Wow, Noah breathed, stepping into the room. This is something else. They spread out to explore, their apprehension momentarily forgotten in the face of this unexpected discovery. Chloe focused on photographing the elaborate light fixtures hanging from the ceiling, their crystal prisms still catching the faint light. Maya examined the built-in cabinets along one wall, pulling out dusty ledgers and files. Liam walked over to the windows, careful to avoid the shards of broken glass scattered across the floor. From this height, he could see the entire factory complex spread out beneath him, a vast expanse of decaying buildings and overgrown courtyards. The moonlight, now visible through breaks in the clouds, gave everything a silvery, ethereal quality. It was beautiful in a haunting, but they were all still engrossed in their explorations on the other side of the room. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a reflection in the remaining glass panes. That's when he first felt it. A subtle shift in the air pressure, like someone had walked past him very quickly, very close. A chill ran down his spine, despite the heavy jacket he was wearing. "Hey guys," he began, his voice sounding strangely hesitant. "Did anyone else just—" Before he could finish his sentence, all of their headlamps flickered simultaneously. For a split second, the room was plunged into complete darkness. When the lights came back on, a collective gasp filled the air. "Okay, that was weird," Chloe said, her voice trembling slightly. "Battery interference. Maybe all four of our lights at exactly the same time?" Liam asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "That's not interference. That's—" He trailed off, unable to articulate what he thought it was. "Let's get out of here," Maya said, her voice urgent. "Now." No one argued. They turned to leave, moving faster now, their earlier sense of wonder replaced by a growing sense of dread. The temperature seemed to be dropping rapidly. Liam could see his breath forming white clouds in the beam of his headlamp. As they reached the doorway leading back to the stairs, Liam noticed something he hadn't seen before. The sounds of their footsteps had changed. Instead of 4 distinct sets of footfalls, he could clearly hear 5. The extra set of steps was slightly out of sync with their own, like someone following them, just a fraction of a second behind. He stopped abruptly, turning around, shining his light back into the boardroom. Nothing. Just the empty table, the broken windows, the shadows. But the footsteps continued, for a heartbeat or two, after they'd all stopped moving. Did anyone else hear that? Liam asked, his voice barely a whisper. Hear what? Noah said, but his face was pale, his eyes wide. Before Liam could explain, a door slammed somewhere above them, the sound echoing through the stairwell like a gunshot. Chloe let out a small scream. Run! Liam shouted, his voice cracking with fear. He didn't need to tell them twice. They bolted down the stairs, taking them two at a time, their headlamps bouncing wildly, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. Liam was at the back of the group, his earlier sense of leadership forgotten in the primal urge to escape. As they reached the second-floor landing, he felt it again, that sensation of something passing close by, something unseen, something cold. This time it was stronger, more defined. He could have sworn he felt fabric brush against his arm, a fleeting touch that left his skin crawling. And then he heard it, a deep, rasping breath right behind his left ear. He froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The others were already halfway down the corridor, their lights receding into the darkness. He wanted to call out to them, to warn them, but his voice was trapped in his throat. The breathing continued, heavy and wet, like someone who had been running for a long time, struggling for air. Slowly, fighting against every instinct screaming at him to flee, Liam turned his head. His headlamp illuminated. Nothing. Empty air. But the breathing didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, closer. That's when he noticed the dust motes, dancing in the beam of his light. They were swirling in a distinct pattern, as if being disturbed by something he couldn't see, something roughly the size and shape of a person. The scream that tore from his throat was unlike anything he'd ever produced before, a raw, animalistic sound of pure terror. He ran. He ran faster than he'd ever run in his life, chasing after the retreating lights of his friends, the sound of that rasping breath and the thud of unseen footsteps following close behind. He caught up with them at the bottom of the main stairs. They were waiting for him, their faces pale and drawn in the glow of their headlamps. What happened? Maya demanded, her voice shaking. What was that scream? Liam couldn't speak. He just pointed back up the stairs, his chest heaving, his lungs burning. That's when they all heard it. Footsteps, descending the stairs behind him. Heavy, deliberate steps, but their lights revealed nothing. They ran for the exit, a blind, desperate scramble through the dark corridors. Liam didn't remember much of that frantic escape. It was all a blur of adrenaline and terror. Somehow, they found their way back to the broken window they'd entered through. Noah went first, practically throwing himself through the opening. He helped Maya, then Chloe. Liam pushed Chloe forward, urging her to go. As she climbed through, he felt something grab his ankle. The touch was ice cold and felt like fingers, but wrong, too many, too long. He kicked out, a desperate, instinctive reaction, and felt his leg come free. He scrambled through the window, not daring to look back. They didn't stop running until they reached Noah's car. Chloe was sobbing uncontrollably. Maya looked like she was about to be sick, and Noah's hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key into the ignition. As they peeled out of the parking lot, Liam looked back at the factory. In a third-floor window, the boardroom where they'd been, he saw a light. Not their headlamps, but a pale, bluish glow. As he watched, it moved away from the window and disappeared into the darkness. The police didn't believe their story. They said Liam and his friends were probably spooked by homeless people or other urban explorers. The building inspector they spoke to told them that the third floor of that section had been condemned and sealed off in 1986, after a fatal accident. He wouldn't elaborate. Liam did his own research. He found an old newspaper article from October 1986. A factory foreman, named Arthur Jenkins, had disappeared during his night shift. His body was never found. The official report said he'd probably fallen into some machinery, but no trace of him was ever discovered. The factory closed its third-floor executive offices shortly after that, and rumors began to spread about strange sounds, unexplained accidents, and a pervasive feeling of unease. Liam and his friends never went urban exploring again. The blog was abandoned. Sometimes, when Liam was alone, he thought he heard that heavy, rasping breathing behind him. When he turned around, nothing was there, but the air felt colder, and the dust motes would dance in patterns that looked almost like footprints. He knew what he'd felt in that factory. He knew what they'd all heard, but he also knew that no one would ever believe them. Some places, he realized, were best left unexplored. Some secrets were better left buried in the dust and the darkness. And some stories were better left untold. But he still checked over his shoulder constantly, and he would never ever be the last one in line again. He wished he could unsee what was in that factory. Blackwood's beckoning. Dr. Samuel Sam Walker, a man of routine and reason, found himself increasingly drawn to the idea of escaping the confines of his Seattle life. He and his oldest friend, Mark Olson, a software engineer with a penchant for the outdoors, had a long-standing tradition of weekend camping trips. These excursions were usually predictable, comfortable affairs. Well-trodden trails, established campsites, the reassuring crackle of a campfire under a familiar sky. This time, however, Mark suggested something different. Blackwood Trail, a remote area in the North Cascades, came recommended by one of Mark's colleagues, a taciturn man named Peterson who spoke of pristine wilderness and unparalleled fishing opportunities. Sam, still reeling from a recent and painful separation from his wife, agreed. He needed a distraction, a change of scenery, a break from the relentless hum of the city. They arrived at the trailhead on a Saturday afternoon in early October. The air was crisp and damp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The parking lot was deserted, save for a battered pickup truck parked in a far corner, its paint faded and peeling. "Looks like we've got the place to ourselves," Mark said, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. He checked his phone one last time, a futile gesture given the location. Forecast calls for clear skies tonight, perfect for stargazing. He stuffed the phone into his backpack, a grin spreading across his face. The trail began gently enough, winding through a cathedral of towering Douglas firs and western red cedars. Their boots crunched on fallen leaves and twigs, the sound amplified by the quiet of the forest. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. After about an hour of hiking, they found a suitable clearing, a small, level area nestled among the trees, about 50 yards from a rushing stream. "This looks promising," Mark declared, dropping his heavy pack with a sigh of relief. "Flat ground, good tree cover, close to water. What more could you ask for?" Sam agreed. They set about establishing their camp with the practiced efficiency of seasoned outdoorsmen. Mark, the more mechanically inclined of the two, took charge of erecting their four-person tent, a sturdy, dome-shaped structure that had seen many seasons. Sam gathered firewood, carefully selecting dry branches and arranging them in a neat pile beside a designated fire pit, a circle of stones they constructed themselves. By 4 p.m., their camp was a picture of rustic order. Tent pitched, chairs arranged around the fire pit, a supply of firewood ready for the evening. They spent the remaining daylight hours fishing in the nearby stream, the cold water numbing their fingers. They caught a few small trout, nothing worth keeping, so they released them back into the rushing current. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, they returned to camp to prepare dinner. That's when Sam noticed the first unsettling detail. Their camp chairs, which they'd carefully positioned facing the fire pit, had been moved, not knocked over, as if by a gust of wind, but deliberately repositioned. They now faced the dense woods, their backs to the fire pit. Mark, ever the pragmatist, dismissed it. "Probably someday hikers," he said, shrugging. "Used them for a quick rest. No big deal." He turned the chairs back to their original positions. Sam nodded, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over him. They hadn't seen or heard anyone else on the trail all day. and their campsite was well hidden from the main path. Still, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. They built a fire, the flames crackling merrily, casting a warm glow over their small clearing. They ate freeze-dried chili, its blandness offset by the generous swigs of beer they washed it down with. They told stories, the same ones they'd told countless times before, the familiar narratives, a comforting ritual in the unfamiliar surroundings. Everything felt normal, almost too normal, until around 9 p.m. Mark, in the middle of recounting a particularly embarrassing anecdote from their college days, suddenly stopped talking, his head cocked to one side, his eyes focused on something beyond the firelight. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low.
Sam listen.
At first, all he could hear was the crackling of the fire, the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, the distant murmur of the stream. Then he heard it too. Voices. They were faint, muffled, like people talking quietly in the distance. Too far away to make out any individual words, but definitely human voices. And they seemed to be coming from the dense woods behind their tent, the same direction their chairs had been facing earlier. "Hello," Mark called out, his voice projecting into the darkness. No response. They sat in silence for several minutes, straining their ears. The voices had stopped. Sam grabbed his powerful flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the trees beyond their campsite. He swept the light back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the dense, impenetrable wall of trees, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. "Probably just other campers," Sam said, trying to sound more convinced than he felt. "Maybe they're setting up camp further in." But the voices hadn't sounded like the casual chatter of campers. They'd sounded urgent, almost agitated, like people engaged in a hushed argument. They stayed up for another hour, the fire slowly burning down to embers, their earlier sense of camaraderie replaced by a growing unease. The voices didn't return. Finally, they decided to turn in. Sam made sure their food was properly stored in a bear-resistant canister, which they hung from a high branch some distance from their tent. He checked that his hunting knife, a hefty blade he'd inherited from his grandfather, was within easy reach inside the tent. Then, he slipped into his sleeping bag, the down filling providing little comfort against the chill that had settled over him. He wasn't sure what time it was when he woke up. The moon, partially obscured by clouds, cast a pale, ethereal light over the clearing. He could see Mark's silhouette in his sleeping bag next to him, sitting upright, completely still. "Mark," Sam whispered, his voice raspy with sleep. "There's someone out there," Mark whispered back, his voice tight with fear. "Listen." Sam held his breath. He could hear it now. Footsteps, crunching on the dry leaves and twigs outside their tent. Slow, deliberate steps. They circled the tent once, twice, then stopped directly in front of the entrance. The shadow of a figure fell across the thin nylon wall of the tent, clearly visible in the moonlight. It stood there, motionless, silent. Sam's heart hammered against his ribs. He reached for his knife, his hand trembling. The shadow remained still, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, it moved away, and the footsteps resumed, heading off into the darkness of the forest. Neither of them spoke until the sound had completely faded away. "We need to check outside," Mark said, his voice still shaking. He switched on his headlamp, the beam cutting through the darkness of the tent. "Are you crazy?"
Sam hissed.
"We should stay in here. What if they're waiting? What if they're messing with our food? Or our gear?" Mark countered. "We can't afford to lose our supplies. And what if they come back?" He had a point. They were miles from the nearest road, completely isolated. They couldn't afford to be stranded. They grabbed their flashlights and knives and unzipped the tent as quietly as possible. The clearing looked exactly as they'd left it. The fire pit held cold ashes. Their chairs sat empty around it. The bare canister hung undisturbed from its branch. They swept their flashlight beams through the surrounding trees, but saw nothing unusual. No sign of anyone or anything. "Look at this," Mark said suddenly, his voice low and urgent. His flashlight beam was focused on the ground near the entrance to their tent. A single, clear footprint was pressed into the soft earth. It was much larger than either of their boots, and the shape was strange, elongated with what looked like claw marks at the ends of the toes. They did a complete circuit of their campsite, their anxiety growing with each passing minute. They found nothing else out of place. The forest had fallen completely silent. No insects chirping, no night birds calling, no rustling of leaves in the breeze. Just an unnerving, absolute silence. "Maybe we should pack up," Sam suggested, his voice barely a whisper. "Hike out now. Get back to the car." Mark shook his head. "It's too dangerous to hike in the dark. We'd probably break an ankle or get lost. Better to wait until morning." He was right, of course, but the thought of spending the rest of the night in that clearing, waiting for whatever had made that footprint to return, filled Sam with dread. They went back inside the tent, but neither of them slept. They sat up, backs against their packs, knives in hand, listening to every creak and groan of the forest. Every snapping twig, every rustling leaf made them jump. Around 3:00 a.m., the voices returned. This time they were closer, louder, and there were more of them. They seemed to be coming from all directions, surrounding their tent, moving through the trees. Still that same urgent, muffled quality, like people arguing in hushed tones. Sam couldn't make out any individual words, but the voices didn't sound entirely human. The cadence was off, the pitch slightly distorted like a recording played at the wrong speed. Then they saw the shadows. The moon, now higher in the sky, cast a brighter light on the clearing. Dark shapes began to move across the walls of their tent, visible through the thin nylon. They were human-shaped, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, their movements jerky and unnatural. They passed back and forth, circling the tent like predatory animals. Mark gripped Sam's arm, his fingers digging in so hard it hurt. Neither of them dared to breathe. The shadows kept moving, and the voices grew louder, more agitated. Still no clear words, just that unsettling, muffled arguing. A sharp snap cut through the noise, the distinct sound of a branch breaking nearby. The voices stopped instantly. The shadows disappeared. Complete silence descended once again, heavier and more oppressive than before. Then the tent began to tear. A long, jagged slash appeared in the nylon wall of the tent, near their feet, as if cut by an invisible knife. Cold air rushed in through the opening, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something acrid like ozone. Mark's flashlight beam darted to the tier, but there was nothing there. No knife, no hand, no visible object that could have caused the damage. Another rip appeared, this time on the opposite side of the tent. Then another and another. Tiers opened up all around them, seemingly at random, but with a terrifying purpose. The voices started again, louder now, almost a shout, but still muffled, still incomprehensible. It sounded like a chorus of angry whispers, swirling around them, closing in. "Run!" Mark yelled, his voice cracking with fear. They scrambled out of the tent, tearing through the already damaged entrance, not bothering to unzip it properly. They grabbed their backpacks, the only possessions they could afford to salvage, and fled. The clearing was empty. The voices came from all directions, but there was no one there. Nothing visible moved in the trees. They ran. They ran as fast as they could, following the trail by the pale moonlight, branches whipping at their faces, roots snagging their feet. Behind them, the voices followed, keeping pace, getting closer. And now there were footsteps too, dozens of them, crashing through the undergrowth, a relentless, pursuing tide. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn painting the eastern horizon a pale gray when they finally reached the parking lot. The battered pickup truck was gone. They threw themselves into Mark's car, Sam fumbling with the keys, dropping them twice before managing to get them into the ignition. As they peeled out of the lot, tires spinning on the loose gravel. Sam caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror. Just a glimpse, but it was enough. Dark shapes, impossibly tall and thin, stood at the edge of the trees, watching them leave. Their forms were indistinct in the pre-dawn gloom, but their presence was undeniable. They drove straight home without stopping, without speaking. Neither of them uttered a word until they were back in the city, surrounded by the reassuring normalcy of Sunday morning traffic and bewildered joggers who stared at their scratched faces and torn clothes. We need to go back, Mark said finally, his voice hoarse. In daylight. Get our gear. Report this to the Rangers. Sam agreed. They stopped at his apartment to clean up and grab some coffee, their hands still shaking. Then, they drove back to Blackwood Trail. It took them 3 hours to reach their campsite, following their own trail of broken branches and trampled undergrowth from their panicked flight. The clearing looked normal, peaceful even. Their tent stood there, slashed to ribbons, a pathetic testament to the night's terror. The camp chairs sat exactly where they'd left them. The fire pit held cold ashes. Even the bear canister with their remaining food was untouched. But there were no footprints, none except their own. No sign of the multiple figures that must have made all those voices, all those footsteps. They searched the surrounding area meticulously, driven by a desperate need for some kind of physical evidence, some proof that they weren't going insane. They found nothing. No candy wrappers, no cigarette butts, no broken branches, no sign that anyone or anything else had been there at all. They packed up what they could salvage of their gear and hiked out, the silence of the forest feeling heavier, more ominous than ever before. They filed a report with the park rangers, who listened to their story with polite skepticism, their eyes betraying their disbelief. They said they'd investigate, but Sam never heard anything further. He and Mark still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never anywhere remotely close to Blackwood Trail. They've tried to find rational explanations for what happened. Other hikers playing a cruel prank, some kind of weird mass hallucination, the effects of extreme stress and sleep deprivation. But they both know what they heard. They both know what they saw in the moonlight. Those shadows that moved wrong. Those shapes at the tree line. Sometimes late at night, Sam thinks he hears those muffled voices again, arguing in words he can't quite understand. And he knows, with a chilling certainty, that he'll never go back to those woods alone. He told the story a few times, to close friends, always downplaying the more unbelievable aspects, framing it as a creepy camping experience. Most people laughed it off, attributing it to an overactive imagination. The Rangers never found any evidence of other people being in the area that night. The slashes in their tent, they suggested, could have been caused by an animal. A bear, perhaps. But Sam knew better. He knew what he'd seen. And he knew, with a certainty that haunted his waking hours, that something was still out there, in the depths of Blackwood Forest, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers to venture off the trail, to set up their tents in a quiet clearing, to listen to the sounds of the night, and to hear the voices begin. The marks on the mirror of Morgan's Creek. The first time I noticed the marks, I dismissed them as smudges. Park Ranger Daniel Hayes had been assigned to the Morgan's Creek Dam project for 6 months, a temporary posting that felt increasingly permanent. My job was straightforward: patrol the perimeter, monitor the security cameras, and deter trespassers. It was a lonely job, mostly uneventful, but it paid well. And after the incident, I needed the isolation. The dam itself was a colossal structure of concrete and steel, a testament to human engineering, slowly rising against the backdrop of the Appalachian Mountains. The construction site sprawled across a vast area, a network of access roads, equipment yards, and temporary buildings. It was late October, around 2 a.m., during one of my nightly patrols. I was driving my ATV along the perimeter road, the headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the chain-link fence that surrounded the site. The air was cold, crisp, with a hint of wood smoke from distant homes. The only sounds were the rumble of the ATV's engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Then I saw them, on the surface of the large, Reflective safety mirror positioned at a blind corner of the access road. Marks, not scratches, not cracks, but marks, like something had been drawn on the mirror's surface. I stopped the ATV, killed the engine, and got off, my boots crunching on the gravel. I approached the mirror cautiously, my flashlight beam illuminating the marks. They were symbols, strange, angular symbols that I didn't recognize. They seemed to be etched into the reflective surface, not with a tool, but with something else. Something that had left a faint, almost imperceptible residue. A dark, oily substance that shimmered in the flashlight beam. I touched the marks tentatively. The mirror's surface was cold, smooth, except for where the symbols were etched. There it felt rough, corroded. I took several photos with my phone, my mind racing. Vandalism? Some kind of prank? But the symbols, they didn't look like graffiti. They looked ancient, deliberate. I reported the marks to my supervisor, Chief Ranger Marcus Bell, a gruff, no-nonsense man who had little patience for anything that disrupted the routine of the site. He looked at the photos, his expression skeptical. "Kids," he muttered, "messing around. Probably some new gang sign. I'll have maintenance clean it off." But I knew it wasn't a gang sign. I had seen gang graffiti before, and this was different. Something about the symbols, about their intricate design, about the way they seemed to absorb the light, filled me with a deep, unsettling unease. The maintenance crew tried to clean the mirror, using various solvents and detergents, but the marks wouldn't come off. They seemed to be etched into the reflective surface, impervious to any conventional cleaning methods. "Damn kids," Marcus grumbled, shaking his head. "Must have used some kind of acid. We'll have to replace the whole thing." But I wasn't so sure. The residue I had felt, the oily substance, it didn't seem like acid. It seemed like something else. I started researching, delving into the history of the area, searching for any information about the symbols, about any strange occurrences, any unexplained phenomena. I discovered that the Morgan's Creek Dam project had been controversial from the start, facing opposition from environmental groups, Native American tribes, and local residents. There were rumors of ancient burial grounds being disturbed, of sacred sites being desecrated, of curses. I found old newspaper articles, dating back to the 19th century, mentioning strange lights in the sky, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of a creature that haunted the woods, a creature that was said to leave behind strange markings, symbols of its presence. The local Native American tribe, the Cherokee, had legends about the area, about a spirit that dwelled in the mountains, a guardian of the land that was angered by the encroachment of civilization. The stories were dismissed as folklore, as superstition, but they resonated with what I had seen with the marks on the mirror. The next night, I went back to the same spot, to the same mirror. The marks were still there, unchanged, untouched, but there was something else. More symbols, added to the original ones, expanding the design, making it more complex, more intricate, and there were footprints, large, bare footprints, leading from the woods to the mirror and then back again. They weren't human. The toes were too long, too splayed, the heel too narrow, and there was that same, claw-like impression at the back of each print. The same footprints I had seen at Blackwood. My heart pounded in my chest. My blood ran cold. This wasn't vandalism. This wasn't a prank. This was something else. Something ancient, something powerful, something real. And it was communicating through the marks on the mirror. I took more photos, documenting the new symbols, the footprints, the entire scene. I knew Marcus wouldn't believe me, not without more concrete evidence. But I had to find someone who would, someone who could help me understand what was happening. I remembered a conversation I'd had with Sarah, the woman from Route 60, after the incident with the Shadow Man. She had mentioned her ongoing research into unexplained phenomena, into the thin places where the veil between realities seemed to wear thin. I found her contact information, a phone number scribbled on a scrap of paper I had tucked away in my wallet. I called her, my voice trembling slightly as I explained what I had found, what I suspected. Sarah listened intently, asking questions, probing for details. She didn't dismiss me, didn't ridicule me, didn't treat me like I was crazy. She believed me. The symbols, she said, her voice serious. They're a language, an ancient language, a language of power. She told me about her own research, about her encounters with similar phenomena, about the entities that lurked in the shadows, in the between spaces. These things, they communicate in different ways, she explained. Through symbols, through whispers, through manifestations. They're trying to tell us something, or warn us. Warn us. Ask, about what? About themselves, Sarah replied. About their presence. About their intentions. She agreed to come to Morgan's Creek to help me investigate, to try to decipher the symbols, to understand what was happening. We met the next day at the ranger station. Sarah was just as I remembered her, tall, slender, with an intense gaze and an air of quiet determination. She carried a bag filled with books, maps, and strange electronic devices. We went to the mirror, the one with the marks. Sarah examined the symbols carefully, tracing them with her fingers, her brow furrowed in concentration. This is older than anything I've ever seen, she said, her voice hushed. Predates any known Native American language. It's primordial. She took out a small handheld device, a device that looked like a cross between a Geiger counter and a digital camera. She pointed it at the mirror, at the symbols. The device began to beep, slowly at first, then faster, louder, until it was emitting a continuous, high-pitched whine. There's energy here, Sarah said, her eyes wide. A lot of energy, residual energy, from something. She took photos of the symbols, using a special camera that, she explained, could capture images in different spectrums of light, revealing details invisible to the naked eye. We spent the rest of the day studying the symbols, comparing them to the images in her books, searching for any match, any clue to their meaning. Then, as darkness fell, we got back into the truck. She had a plan. We drove back to the mirror, parking a short distance away, our headlights off. The night was cold, silent, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. We need to see what's making these marks, Sarah said, her voice low. We need to understand its intentions. She explained her plan. She had modified her frequency disruptor, the device she had used on Route 60, to detect not just electromagnetic energy, but also other types of energy, subtle energy, residual energy, the kind of energy that she believed powered the symbols, the manifestations, the entities we were dealing with. If something is there, she said, this will pick it up, and it might even provoke it. Provoke it. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken danger. We got out of the car, Sarah carrying the modified disruptor, I with my service weapon drawn. We approached the mirror cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The marks were still there, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Sarah turned on the disruptor. The device began to hum, a low, throbbing sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air around us. The air grew colder. The metallic scent, now a familiar and unsettling presence, intensified. Then we saw it, a flicker of movement. At the edge of the woods, across the road from the mirror, something was there, watching us. Sarah raised the disruptor, pointing it towards the woods. The humming intensified, becoming a high-pitched whine. The figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall, thin, its form indistinct, shrouded in shadow. But it was undeniably there, and it was moving towards us. Slowly, deliberately, its footsteps making no sound on the gravel road. It was the same figure I had seen at Blackwood, the same entity that many had seen before. But what was it doing? Sarah kept the disruptor trained on the figure, her hand steady, her eyes fixed on the approaching darkness. I raised my weapon, my finger on the trigger, but I hesitated. Something felt wrong. The figure wasn't attacking. It wasn't threatening. It was just walking towards the mirror. It reached the mirror, stopping just inches from the reflective surface. And then it raised its hand. Its long, skeletal fingers traced the symbols on the mirror, one by one, slowly, deliberately. It was drawing. It was creating the marks. As the figure traced the symbols, they began to glow, brighter and brighter, until they seemed to burn with an inner light. The air around the mirror crackled with energy, a tangible force that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Sarah lowered the disruptor slightly, her expression a mixture of awe and fear. "It's communicating," she whispered. "It's using the mirror as a portal."
A conduit.
A portal to where? Conduit for what? The figure finished tracing the symbols. It stepped back from the mirror, its faceless gaze fixed on us. Then the mirror rippled, like a pond disturbed by a stone. The reflective surface of the mirror began to distort, to waver, to change. The symbols glowed even brighter, then faded, disappearing completely. And in their place, an image began to form. Not a reflection of the surrounding forest, not a reflection of us, but something else. A scene, a different place, a different time. We saw a forest ancient and vast, bathed in the golden light of a setting sun. We saw a group of people, Native Americans, dressed in ceremonial garb, gathered around a large oak tree. They were chanting, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence. They were performing a ritual of banishment. We saw them drawing symbols on the ground, the same symbols that had appeared on the mirror, the same symbols that were associated with protection, with containment. We saw them forcing a figure, a tall, dark figure with no face, into a circle of fire, into a prison of light. We saw them sealing the figure within the tree, binding it to the earth, banishing it from their world. The image flickered, then faded, replaced by the normal reflection of the forest, of ourselves, of the night. The mirror was clear, blank. The symbols were gone. The figure was still there, standing across the road, its faceless gaze fixed on us. But it was different. It was weaker, diminished, its form less distinct, its presence less menacing. It raised its arm, its hand outstretched, not in a gesture of threat, but in a plea. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the woods. We watched it go, our hearts pounding in our chests, our minds reeling from what we had just witnessed. We had seen the past. We had seen the origin of the creature, of the darkness, of the curse. And we had seen its imprisonment. The mirror, it wasn't just a reflector. It was a window into another time, another reality. And the figure, it wasn't the monster. It was the jailer. It was trying to keep the creature contained. It was trying to prevent it from escaping. The symbols, they weren't a warning. They were a message, plea for help, a desperate attempt to communicate, to maintain the seal, to prevent the darkness from breaking free. We understood now. The figure, the herder, the jailer, it was a guardian, a protector bound to this place, tasked with containing the ancient evil that lurked within the earth. It had been using the mirrors, the reflective surfaces, as a way to communicate, to warn, to seek assistance. And we had misunderstood. We had misinterpreted its actions, its intentions. We had seen it as a threat, when in reality it was our only ally. Sarah lowered the disruptor completely, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and regret. We almost destroyed it," she whispered. "We almost released the darkness." I nodded slowly, my own guilt weighing heavily on me. We had been so focused on our fear, on our preconceived notions, that we had failed to see the truth. We had almost made a terrible mistake. We spent the rest of the night studying the images we had captured, the photos of the symbols, the video of the figure drawing on the mirror. We compared them to the ancient texts, to the Native American legends, to the historical records. We discovered that the ritual we had witnessed in the mirror was not a banishment, not exactly. It was a binding, a way to contain the creature, to imprison it within the earth, within a specific location. And that location was Morgan's Creek. The dam project, the construction, the excavation, it had disturbed the ancient seal. It had weakened the prison. It had allowed the creature to stir. And the figure, the jailer, had been trying to warn us, to stop us, to prevent the creature from escaping completely. We knew what we had to do. We had to repair the seal. We had to reperform the ritual. We had to contain the darkness once again. But this time, we would do it right. This time, we would understand. We would work with the figure, not against it. We would help it to fulfill its ancient duty, to protect the world from the evil that lurked beneath Morgan's Creek. We had a long road ahead of us, a difficult, dangerous task, but we were ready. We had learned our lesson. We had faced our fears, and we had finally understood the truth. The darkness was real, but so was the light. And as long as there were those willing to stand against the shadows, to protect the innocent, to listen to the whispers, there was always hope. The mirrors we knew would be our guide, and the figure our unlikely ally. We just had to learn to trust the silence and see the truth beyond the reflection. The disappearing hitchhiker of Route 42. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the headlights of my semi-truck, turning the asphalt of Route 42 into a shimmering black mirror. It was 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I, Richard Rick Olson, was hauling a load of lumber from Oregon to Nevada. I'd been driving trucks for over 20 years, seen my share of bad weather, long hauls, and lonely nights. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night near mile marker 66. I saw him standing on the shoulder, thumb outstretched, a classic hitchhiker silhouette against the rain-swept darkness. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark, hooded raincoat. I usually don't pick up hitchhikers' company policy and all, but something about him, something about the way he stood there, so still, so forlorn, made me slow down. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the late hour. Maybe it was just plain loneliness. Whatever it was, I pulled over, the air brakes hissing as I brought the 18-wheeler to a stop. The hitchhiker approached the passenger side, his movements quick and fluid. He opened the door and climbed in, bringing with him the scent of wet asphalt and something else. Something I couldn't quite place, a faint, almost metallic odor. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the drumming of the rain on the roof of the cab. "I appreciate it." "No problem," I replied, glancing at him. He kept his hood up, shadowing his face. I could only make out the glint of his eyes in the dim light of the dashboard. "Where you headed?" "South," he said. "As far as you're going." I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, the wipers working furiously to clear the windshield. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the hum of the engine, the drumming of the rain, and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. "You see many hitchhikers out here?" he asked, suddenly breaking the silence. "Not many," I replied, "especially not on a night like this." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Guess I'm lucky then." I glanced at him again. His hood still obscured his face, but I could see the outline of his jaw, his chin, his nothing. My blood ran cold. Where his face should have been, there was only darkness, a blank, featureless void. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. The truck skidded, the tires losing traction on the wet asphalt. I fought to regain control, wrestling the steering wheel, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was I hallucinating? Was it the lack of sleep, the long hours on the road playing tricks on my mind? The truck finally came to a stop, halfway on the shoulder, halfway in the lane. I turned to look at the passenger seat. It was empty. The hitchhiker was gone. The door was closed, latched. There was no sign that anyone had been sitting there, except for a faint, damp patch on the seat and that lingering metallic odor. I sat there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I tried to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe he had jumped out while I was braking. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe, but I knew better. I knew what I had seen, or rather what I hadn't seen. A face. I put the truck in gear and slowly pulled back onto the highway, my senses on high alert, my every nerve ending screaming at me to get out of there, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that spot. I drove for another hour, not seeing another car, not seeing another soul. The rain continued to fall relentless, washing away any trace of the hitchhiker, of his presence, of his absence. I finally reached a truck stop, a brightly lit oasis in the vast, dark expanse of the highway. I pulled in, parked, and killed the engine, my body exhausted, my mind reeling. I needed coffee, strong coffee, and I needed to talk to someone, anyone, just to hear a human voice, to reassure myself that I wasn't going crazy. I went inside the truck stop diner, the smell of greasy food and stale coffee filling the air. A few truckers were scattered around the tables, talking, laughing, eating. A waitress, her face tired but friendly, poured me a cup of coffee. I sat down at the counter, taking a long sip of the hot, bitter liquid. It helped a little. I started telling the waitress about the hitchhiker, about his disappearance, about the lack of a face. She listened patiently, her expression unchanging. When I finished, she just nodded slowly. "Route 42, she said, her voice low. "You saw him on Route 42, didn't you?" I nodded, surprised.
Yeah.
"Near mile marker 66. How did you know?" She sighed, leaning against the counter. "Heard that story before," she said. "Many times. Truckers, mostly. They pick up a hitchhiker, a tall, thin guy in a raincoat, and then he vanishes, just like that. But what about his face?" I asked. Did they see his face?" The waitress hesitated. "Some say he has no face," she said. "Just darkness. Others say he has the face of someone they know. Someone dead." My blood ran cold. The face of someone dead? What did that mean? "Who is he?" I asked. "What is he?" The waitress shrugged. "Nobody knows," she said. "Just a story, a legend. They call him the vanishing hitchhiker of Route 42. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the diner, drinking coffee, talking to other truckers, listening to their stories, their experiences. Many of them had heard of the vanishing hitchhiker. Some had even claimed to have seen him. The stories were all similar. A tall, thin figure, hitchhiking on a lonely stretch of Route 42. Sometimes he had no face. Sometimes he had the face of a deceased loved one. Sometimes he simply disappeared. No one knew who he was or what he wanted. But everyone agreed on one thing: he was not human. I finished my haul, delivering the lumber to Nevada, and then picked up a new load heading back east. I tried to avoid Route 42, taking a longer, more circuitous route, but eventually I had to face it. I had to drive that stretch of highway again. I dreaded it, of course, but I also felt a strange compulsion. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what I had seen, what I had experienced. I drove Route 42 during the day, the sun shining brightly, the traffic relatively heavy. Nothing happened. The road seemed ordinary, almost disappointingly so, but I knew the night would be different. I waited until after midnight, then I started my run, heading south on Route 42, my heart pounding in my chest, my senses on high alert. The rain started again, a light drizzle at first, then growing heavier, turning into a downpour. The wipers worked furiously, struggling to clear the windshield. I reached mile marker 66, the spot where I had picked up the hitchhiker before. I slowed down, scanning the shoulder, my headlights cutting through the darkness. Nothing. I continued driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The static started on the radio, a faint, hissing sound that gradually increased in intensity. Then I saw him, standing on the shoulder, thumb outstretched, a tall, thin figure in a dark raincoat. The same hitchhiker. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I kept driving, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, my foot pressing down on the accelerator. But in my rearview mirror, I saw him. He was running, running alongside my truck, keeping pace with the 18-wheeler, his movements impossibly fast, his legs a blur, and he was gaining. I floored it, the engine roaring in protest, the speedometer needle climbing. 70 miles per hour, 80 miles per hour, 90 miles per hour. The truck vibrated violently, the tires struggling for traction on the wet asphalt. But the hitchhiker kept pace. He was right beside me now, his hooded figure visible in my side mirror, his arm outstretched, his hand almost touching the door handle. I could see his face, or rather, the lack of it. Just a blank, featureless void, a darkness that seemed to absorb the light. Then he spoke. His voice, a low rumble, somehow audible above the roar of the engine and the drumming of the rain. Richard, my name. How did he know my name? He reached for the door handle, his long, skeletal fingers wrapping around the metal. I swerved, violently, trying to shake him off, but he held on, his grip impossibly strong. The door handle turned. The door creaked open. I screamed, a raw, primal scream of terror. I grabbed the steering wheel with both hands, fighting to maintain control of the truck, fighting to keep the door closed, fighting to survive. Then I remembered something, a story I had heard in the diner from an old trucker, a grizzled veteran with a 1,000-yard stare. He had told me about the vanishing hitchhiker, about how to get rid of him. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was my only chance. I reached for the CB radio, my hand trembling. I switched it on, the speaker crackling with static. I keyed the microphone. "Breaker 19, I said, my voice hoarse and unsteady. "This is Big Rig Rick, heading south on 42. I've got a situation here. A passenger. I need to drop off." I paused, taking a deep breath. Then I spoke the words the old trucker had told me, the words that were supposed to work. "This passenger, he's got no fare. He's got no name. He's got no face. And he's looking for a ride to the other side." I released the microphone. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, a voice crackled over the CB. A voice I didn't recognize. A voice that was both human and something else. "We hear you, Big Rig Rick," the voice said. "We'll take him," the hitchhiker screamed. A high-pitched, ear-splitting shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. His grip on the door handle loosened. His form flickered, wavered, then vanished. The door slammed shut. I was alone. I didn't stop driving. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I just kept going, my hands clenched on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I drove until I reached the next state, until I saw the sun rise, until I felt safe. I never drove Route 42 again. I requested a transfer, a different route, a different territory. I didn't care where, as long as it was far away from that stretch of highway, far away from mile marker 66, far away from the vanishing hitchhiker. But the experience, it stayed with me, changed me. I started seeing things, fleeting glimpses of shadows, of figures, in my peripheral vision. I would hear whispers in the silence, faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from inside my own head. I started carrying a small silver cross with me at all times, a gift from the old trucker at the diner. He had told me it would protect me from the hitchhiker, from the darkness. I didn't know if it worked, but it gave me some small measure of comfort. I started researching, delving into the history of Route 42, searching for any information about the vanishing hitchhiker, about other disappearances, about strange occurrences. I found stories, rumors, legends, dating back decades, truckers, travelers, locals, all reporting similar encounters, similar experiences. The hitchhiker, it seemed, was a permanent fixture on Route 42, a restless spirit, a lost soul, something that preyed on the lonely, the vulnerable, the unwary. And the CB radio, it wasn't just a means of communication. It was a conduit, a way to connect with something else, something that existed beyond our world, beyond our understanding, something that could take the hitchhiker away. But where did it take him, and why? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I continued to drive, to haul loads, to live my life. But I was different now. I was aware. I was vigilant. I knew the darkness was out there, waiting, watching, whispering. And I knew that sometimes the most terrifying encounters are the ones that leave no trace, the ones that vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions and fear and the lingering scent of something metallic. I still hear the whispers sometimes, especially on rainy nights, especially when I'm alone. And I always keep my CB radio on, just in case. Just in case I need to call for help. Just in case I need to send another passenger to the other side. The road is long, and the night is dark. And sometimes, the things we pick up along the way are not what they seem. The County General Watchman, Arthur Jenkins, wasn't afraid of the dark. As a night shift security guard at County General Hospital, darkness was his constant companion. For 10 years, he'd patrolled the quiet corridors, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He knew every creak of the old building, every hum of the aging machinery, every subtle shift in air pressure that signaled a change in the weather. But that night, something was different. It was a Tuesday in late October, around 3 a.m. Arthur was making his usual rounds, starting on the ground floor and working his way up. Everything seemed normal. Mrs. Davison at the front desk was engrossed in her nightly crossword puzzle. The ER was relatively quiet, just a few patients being treated for minor ailments. The cafeteria was dark and locked, the gift shop's motion sensor light flickering on as he passed. 4th floor, psychiatric ward, all secure. 5th floor, maternity. He could hear the faint cry of a newborn baby somewhere down the hall. 6th floor, oncology. The night nurse, a weary-looking woman named Sarah, gave him a tired wave. 7th floor, mostly empty, used for storage and some disused administrative offices. Then the east corridor of the 8th floor. That's where the unease began. It started with the cold. The hospital's heating system was notoriously temperamental, but this was different. This was a bone-chilling cold that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Arthur could see his breath forming white clouds in the air. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the already unsettling hallway seem even more menacing. This wasn't unusual in the older sections of the hospital, but tonight it felt different. And then there was the silence. Hospitals were never truly silent, even at night. There was always a background hum of activity. The whirring of ventilation systems, the distant murmur of voices, the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment. But this silence was profound, absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled all sound. That's when Arthur saw it. About 50 feet ahead, something moved. A figure, tall and thin, standing with its back to him. It was wearing what looked like a hospital gown, but it was dirty and torn, hanging loosely on its gaunt frame. The figure's head was bald, the skin a sickly, grayish-white color. "Hey!" Arthur called out, his voice echoing in the silence. Hospital protocol dictated that he identify himself first, ask questions later. "This area is restricted. You need to return to your room." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it started to move away from him, towards the sealed double doors at the far end of the corridor. His gait was unsettling. Each step seemed labored, painful, the legs bending in ways that made Arthur's stomach churn. He reached for his radio, his hand fumbling with the clip on his belt. "Front desk, this is Jenkins. Got a patient wandering on 8 East. Requesting backup. Static. Nothing but static." He tried again. "Front desk, do you copy? I need assistance on 8 East." Still nothing. The figure reached the double doors. These were the entrance to the old psychiatric wing, a section of the hospital that had been closed down in 2003 after a fire. The doors were heavy steel, chained and padlocked. Arthur had checked those locks himself just 20 minutes earlier. "Stop right there," Arthur shouted, his voice rising in pitch. He started walking faster, his flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. "You can't go in there. It's dangerous." The figure paused. Slowly, deliberately, its head began to turn. Not its body, just its head, rotating much further than a human neck should be capable of. Arthur caught a glimpse of its face and froze. There were no eyes, just smooth, gray skin where eyes should have been. The mouth was a gaping, lipless gash, filled with something that gleamed wetly in the beam of Arthur's flashlight teeth. Too many and too sharp. His training, years of security protocols, evaporated in an instant. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that thing. But his legs were locked in place, his muscles frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The thing's mouth opened wider, a silent, grotesque yawn. A sound emerged, not a scream, not a growl, but something in between, like wet fabric tearing or the rasp of bone against bone. Then it stepped backward through the solid steel doors and vanished. Arthur stood there, paralyzed, for what felt like an eternity. The cold was intense, biting through his uniform, chilling him to the bone. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. Finally, he forced himself to move. He walked, slowly, hesitantly, towards the doors. The chains were still intact, the padlock still securely fastened. No sign of forced entry, no indication that anything had passed through. But on the floor, in front of the doors, was a single wet footprint. It was slowly fading, evaporating into the air, but it was undeniably there. A print that was too long, too narrow, the toes splayed in an unnatural way. Arthur ran. He ran all the way back to the security office on the ground floor, his lungs burning, his legs aching. Mrs. Davison looked up from her crossword puzzle as he burst in, her eyes widening in alarm. "Arthur, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." He gasped for breath, trying to regain control of his voice. Did you get my radio call?" "What call?" Mrs. Davison frowned. "The radio's been working fine all night. I just talked to Rodriguez on the ground floor." Arthur didn't explain. He went to the security monitors, pulling up the feed from the 8th floor East Corridor camera. Nothing. Just an empty hallway, the flickering fluorescent lights casting their usual shadows. He rewound the footage, his hands shaking as he searched for the timestamp corresponding to his encounter. There he was, walking down the corridor, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He watched himself stop, stand perfectly still for almost 5 minutes, then turn and run. But there was no figure in a hospital gown. No impossible creature with no eyes and a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth. Just Arthur, alone in the hallway, apparently reacting to nothing. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. Who would believe him? He was a security guard, a man of logic and observation, not a purveyor of fantastical tales. He knew how it would sound. "I saw a monster in the hospital." He'd be labeled as unstable, unreliable, maybe even lose his job. So he kept quiet. He did his rounds, wrote his reports, and tried to forget. But he couldn't. The 8th floor got colder every night. Equipment started malfunctioning, not just radios, but phones, cameras, even the automatic doors. Always in that East Corridor, always around 3 a.m. The nurses complained of feeling uneasy, of being watched. They started avoiding that section of the hospital after dark. A week after the first incident, Arthur saw it again. This time, it was on the 7th floor, in a storage room filled with old medical equipment. He was doing his routine check when he heard a scraping sound from above. He looked up, and there it was, clinging to the ceiling like some grotesque insect, its limbs splayed, its eyeless face turned towards him. It left wet footprints on the ceiling, marks that vanished within seconds. Arthur ran. Again. He checked the security cameras. Again, nothing. The third time was in the stairwell between the 6th and 7th floors. He was taking the stairs, avoiding the elevators after the second incident, when he saw it crouched in a corner landing, making that wet, tearing sound. When it saw him, it smiled. A grotesque, lipless grin that stretched all the way to where its eyes should have been. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Arthur started researching the hospital's history. He spent his days off in the local library, poring over old newspaper archives and microfilmed records. He discovered that the fire in the old psychiatric wing wasn't the only tragedy that had occurred at County General. In 1998, a patient named Marcus Cole had murdered 3 nurses and 2 other patients before killing himself. The official report said he'd used a stolen scalpel, but the rumors, whispered among the older staff, were far more disturbing. They spoke of bodies found partially consumed. Cole had been tall and thin, his body ravaged by cancer and chemotherapy. The nurse's notes described him as having an unusual degree of flexibility, an almost unnatural ability to contort his limbs. Some kind of rare connective tissue disorder, they speculated. Arthur was writing this all down now, sitting at his desk in the security office. It was 2:45 a.m. In 15 minutes, he had to start his rounds. The temperature in the office was already dropping. His radio was crackling with static, a faint, rhythmic interference that made his teeth ache. Yesterday, he'd found old blueprints of the 8th floor, tucked away in a forgotten file cabinet. The psychiatric wing wasn't completely sealed off. There was a maintenance tunnel, a narrow, claustrophobic passage that connected it to the main building. According to the plans, the tunnel emerged in a storage closet on the 7th floor, the same closet where the cleaning staff kept complaining about missing supplies and strange noises. He'd been having dreams, too.
Nightmares? Really?
In them, he was walking through the abandoned psychiatric wing, the fire damage still visible on the walls, the air thick with the smell of smoke and decay. He was searching for something important, something that had been left behind when they sealed off the wing. In the dreams, he could hear that wet, tearing sound, getting closer and closer. And he knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that the thing he'd been seeing in the hospital wasn't Marcus Cole. It was something else, something that had been using Cole's body, something that had been there long before Cole arrived, and had remained long after he was gone. The night shift supervisor, a man named Mr. Davies, had called Arthur into his office yesterday. He'd said Arthur seemed distracted lately, not himself. He'd asked if everything was okay at home, mentioned that other staff members had noticed Arthur talking to himself during rounds. He'd suggested, gently but firmly, that Arthur might want to consider taking some time off. Arthur hadn't told him about the thing in the hallways. He hadn't told him about the dreams, or the blueprints, or the growing certainty in his gut that something profoundly wrong was happening in the hospital. He just nodded, smiled weakly, and said he was fine, just a little tired. But he knew what he had to do. Tonight, after his 3 a.m. round, he was going into that maintenance tunnel. He had to see what was in the old psychiatric wing. He had to understand what this thing was and what it wanted. The temperature in the office dropped another 10 degrees. His coffee cup vibrated slightly on the desk. The static on the radio grew louder, more insistent. It was time for his rounds.